Chapter 157. A Buyi, who contacted the merchants in Chuyan City and reminded them to go to the first exchange office to get the deposit for futures trading, finally died in a sewer ditch. However, the marionette, who had no other thoughts except for work, died much more peacefully than the general manager of the exchange office. At least he didn't have to endure the pain of having to beg others to apologize for him when he was halfway through the dissection. Why did the communication stop? Why did he dare to disobey the order of the Senate and continue to fight outside? His army must retreat at once. If the fire in Chuyan City is not extinguished in time, it will spread to the whole empire in a few days. Blood oozed out of the gauze wrapped around the neck and shoulder. Although the member controlled by the Grand Vexer did not succeed, the cursed dagger still hurt the health of the stabbed person. The president of the Senate became more anxious because of the pain. The magic treatment was slowly taking effect, but he still hoped that his wound and the neon people would heal as soon as possible. After the fire in the city and the assassination of the speaker, the noble senators all stayed in the council hall of the Council of Elders. It was not to say that they were under house arrest, but they needed to quickly decide on solutions based on the development of the situation. The bull was naturally among them, but his mind was not here at all. The fire in Chuyan City affected the trade in the city, but the talent market in Jiangjin was not here. The slave trade was still going on, which meant that there were some accounts that had not been personally audited. This auditing system was related to the safe operation of the Neon Empire. After all, there were many interplane transactions that could not be known by a second person. Demons, Yugros. He could not afford to offend the big customers of the outer planes. Fire Jin, Water Jin. When it came to their own interests, the sultans of the inner planes were even more ruthless. The only reason why he could control his temper and stay here was because of the assassination attempt yesterday. The bull did not believe that the general would rashly attack the president of the Senate without informing him in advance. Presumably, the injured old fox also understood the reason. Politics was indeed a game of backstabbing, but stabbing someone in the open crossed the bottom line, and no rational ruler would choose to cross this line to maintain order. The noble who had carried out the assassination had been repeatedly examined by high-level spellcasters, and it had been confirmed that he was under the influence of a very powerful enchantment spell. But at this moment, His Excellency the President only ordered that the criminal be detained for treatment and ignored for the time being. There was no severe punishment, nor was there any attempt to clear the name of the general who had been wronged. This was very abnormal. In the past few hundred years, there had been countless disagreements between the old fox and the general. When it came to the core interests of the Wusong Empire, both sides would choose to compromise. However, at this moment, the general was leading the most elite forces of Japan on an expedition against the powerful Medici Empire. When the outcome of the war was still uncertain, the president of the Senate seemed to want to cause trouble in the rear. The bull warned himself that he must be careful when it came to the people he had sworn loyalty to. That was why he chose to wait patiently in the council hall of the Council of Elders, ignoring the important accounts in the river and listening to the nobles' bullshit about the insurance compensation plan. They were not nobles at all, but a motley crew who only knew how to calculate small accounts. The president, who had lost his temper, kept listening to the secret reports from the assistant mages in his ears. His grandson's dissection as an apology did not ease the anxiety and anger in his heart. If it was possible, he even wanted to personally chop that incompetent descendant into pieces. The wound on his shoulder was bleeding again. The healing mage said that it was a good thing, which meant that the effect of the poison was fading under the effect of the magic, and the coagulated lump in the blood vessels was being expelled from the body with the blood circulation. He took another sip of the life-restoring potion and endured the disgusting smell that was similar to the gold juice that was used to defend the city when he was young. He swallowed the potion. The bad taste lingering in his mouth seemed to remind him of the time when he was young. He endured the pain and pinched the wound. Under the skin that had been pampered for hundreds of years, the strong muscles made him sigh. At that time, he was just an apprentice blacksmith. The highest goal in life was to inherit his master's blacksmith's business even if he had to endure sleeping with the blacksmith's daughter, whose waist was thicker than his, every night. There were always injuries at work, but fortunately, they were not serious. The worst was when the weapon he hammered was not to the liking of the nobles who served him in the blacksmith shop. He was hung up and whipped for an hourglass. Not to mention that in the end, he returned the favor with double. As a blacksmith's apprentice, he had to work around the furnace every day like bees around a beehive full of honey. When the ground or particles in the furnace turned from red to lemon and then melted into bright gold and white, he had to quickly clean out the slag and lime. Once the color was correct, he had to immediately take down the glowing crucible and hang it in a metal holder with a crossbar. Then, he had to change the tool to lift the holder and pour the molten iron from the crucible into the mold. The molds were all different. Some were in the shape of a box, filled with wet sand, and had a few holes in the top. Some were made of two stone molds tied together by metal strips. There were also molds that were made of clay pots. A variety of items could be produced in the mold, cooled slowly or quickly under the action of air, water, or oil. Some were daily necessities, some were needed by the city, and some were standard weapons. Iron balls on the flail, maces, stirrups, paper clips, camel beasts, carts pulled by camel beasts, cooks or construction workers, and so on. However, when it came to making better weapons, these elementary tricks were not enough. Some iron blocks that were placed in the open mold to cool down will be taken out by a real blacksmith to be reheated. After reaching a certain temperature, a special material would be added to it, and the iron would become steel. Only good steel could make good weapons with elasticity. Pecan leaves and vanadium compound powder. This was the secret of the special material formula that the young speaker had learned when he was a thief. However, it took a longer time to put in the amount of food. The blacksmith apprentice was more creative than the master. He created the technique of mixing several iron sheets and steel sheets. Later, he invented a new technique of stamping iron sheets with animal power. The blacksmith became a steel merchant, and the steel merchant became the royal advisor of Japan at that time. After applying the stamping process to the production of Japanese silver coins, the steel merchant and royal advisor suddenly became the head of the #1 exchange house in Japan. He was the richest man in the world. After overthrowing the monarchy, he naturally became the leader of the Japanese Senate, a new group of merchants and nobles. He took another step forward and became the current speaker. The old fox's history of making a fortune was remarkable. The stepping stones for him to climb to the top of the table of power in Chuyin City were industry and finance, not the family slave trade like other senators. Therefore, at this time, he knew better than anyone else in the assembly hall how terrible the tame beast under his feet was. Chapter 158. According to the general's plan, they might encounter groups of vulture riders, roaring dragons, and buzzing locusts. However, he did not foresee the snowstorm that the fleet was experiencing at the moment. In his plan, the most extreme weather would be the icy rain that fell on the lookout's face. Both in Medic and Wozang, the people were used to the endless yellow sand and had never seen the scene of heavy snow. This was somewhat out of Quest's expectations. After his suggestion was accepted, it was actually carried out so thoroughly. After a statement jointly issued by a marshal, a general, and 2 pasha was sent to Bite City by magic, Pharaoh immediately announced the adoption of the military resolution. Several coal-producing cities that the Wusan airships could pass through were heavily guarded. The Magic Research Institute in Bite City sent 50 black-robed mages under the leadership of several mentors to start the work of summoning the wind and summoning the rain. Gray-robed mages from various places took off on flying carpets and assumed the role of scouts. However, they only needed to use eagle eyes to observe the airships from afar. Megalosaurus Pasha followed the big-bellied man and the old marshal to the temporary camp of Medica's mages. It was beyond the territory of the province under its jurisdiction, so the military command was naturally delegated to the highest-ranking medic marshal. Keys came alone. Snader was very interested in the machinery on the back of the fallen heavenly hound, and he wanted to see the movement pattern of the Medica's mages. Therefore, the sorcerer consultant stayed in Rust City for the time being, collecting the parts of the cloud's soaring wings that had been scattered when it crashed while waiting for his employer's orders. The medic mages first lit tens of thousands of candles in the camp. This was a kind of ritualistic magic. The spirit candles were made from the oil extracted from the bodies of the dead and mixed with alchemy spices, which are the most important casting materials. The noble sentiment of voluntary offering gave the spirit candles a great power of will. With this power, they could not only dispel the curse of impurity, but also force the powerful summoned creatures to serve the medic mages willingly. The clay pots carved with various patterns were broken one by one. For a moment, a strong wind blew, but it could not extinguish the tiny flames of the spirit candles in the array. Dozens of gas djinns showed themselves. Led by a noble, they began to bargain with the mages who had been waiting for a long time. Layers of slate with cloud patterns were piled up, and the mages built a huge archway. Meat smeared with honey was set up over the bonfire, giving off a sweet smell. Muffled sounds came from the archway. It was the sound of the cloud giants slapping their bellies on the other side of the portal. They shouted the name of their god. Mano, they had come here to pay their respects. Chi-Jin, cloud giant, and even two Gulabrizu appeared in the corner of the camp under Kitha's astonished gaze. Of course, they did not know that they had bought a one-way ticket to come to the material plane. Under the joint suppression of several spellcasters, the Thanner reed demons from the bottomless abyss were put into special pottery like human swine. Their limited benediction spell-like ability was extracted and used to sound the horn of the storm. The strong wind gathered the sand in this area. The cloud giants, who had eaten and drunk to their heart's content, put away the high-quality honey in their earthen jars and began to chant a powerful spell that could change the weather using the language of the giants. The gas giants, who had obtained the enslavement contract, rose into the air like a gust of wind and directly turned into a whirlwind to create clouds and rain. This may not be enough. Keyes looked at the operation of the medic mages, thought for a moment, and gave a pertinent comment. He had seen the images of the Japanese airship fleet on the way here. A brave mage in a gray robe, who was a scout, quickly approached the sky fortress with a flying carpet. There was no doubt that he died in the hands of the Japanese. However, the magic images sent back by the mage before his death gave Medic first-hand information about the enemy's new weapon. The balloon that provided the lift for the airship was not a hole, but was made up of many smaller air sacs scattered in the shape of grapes. The pipes that transported hot air were connected to each air sacs. Breaking one or a few air sacs alone would not make the airship fall. A large number of airships were suspended under the balloon. Instead, they were connected by thick hemp ropes mixed with animal tendons or simply iron chains. Between the suspended airships, there were either wooden bridges or climbing ropes. People and materials could be transferred and exchanged at any time. Compared to the size of the airships, the aerial combat platforms could be regarded as small fortresses. Each of these sky fortresses was hung with flags painted with different noble patterns. Obviously, they belonged to different Japanese nobles, but at this moment, they were gathered into an alliance and were under the command of the general. The sky fortresses also had small boats that were dedicated to feeding the eagles. The sky fortresses and the flying boats that were suspended in the air with anti-gravity enchantment probably used these eagles to communicate. Some important messages would also be transmitted through magic, but less urgent messages would still rely on the eagle messenger method. It was precisely because of good communication that more than 30 airships could maintain a goose formation and move forward. The stable sky fortresses were like two solid arms, firmly protecting the more flexible airships that could not withstand a strong wind. According to the analysis of the magic images, Keyes felt that although the arrangement of the medic mages would work, it would be difficult to achieve what they had expected. If they wanted to rely on the cold air to make these sky fortresses fall from the clouds, they would at least have to prepare for a more violent storm. But in fact, these black-robed mages of the Academy were more extreme than the young Blue Dragon had imagined. Their original plan was not to stop with the storm. They wanted to let the Japanese see the rare snowstorm in the Ash World. Two more creatures appeared from the latest summoning circle set up by the medic mages. One of them looked like a large, beautiful woman carved out of pure, transparent ice. Her eyes flickered with white flames, and mist overflowed from her body and evaporated into the air. Below her torso, her body turned into a constantly changing icicle, connecting her to the ice below. The other was a large, beautiful woman made entirely of bright, white snowflakes. She had a pair of silver eyes that were so bright that no one could look directly at them. The snowflakes loomed around her like a layer of hazy gauze that blocked the view of prying eyes. Below her torso, her body turned into a whirlpool of snowstorm, connecting her to the snow. The Ice Prophet and the Snow Prophet, two powerful elemental summoned creatures, stepped into the material plane from the ice elemental plane of the inner world. The two elemental creatures seemed to be somewhat dissatisfied with the dry and hot climate of the ash world. After looking at each other, the elemental pool under their feet intensified. The elemental ice that was constantly being stirred and ground was scattered with swirling elemental snow. Ice and snow complemented each other, freezing the air into a biting cold wind. The mortal mages could not help but shiver. The black-robed mages, who had long been prepared, took out two talismans and raised them high above their heads before stepping into the range of the ice elemental pool. Without the permission of the Ice Prophet, any creature that walked into the elemental pool had to be immune to the elements. Otherwise, they would continue to suffer from the cold, and even face the danger of being frozen into powder. But even if the talisman in his hand could protect the black-robed mage in the elemental pool, he was still so cold that his teeth chattered. Because any high temperature could be seen as an offense by the creatures of the ice elemental plane, he had to resist the urge to release a spell to warm himself up while restraining the numbness in his mouth and tongue to talk. Noble guests from the ice elemental plane, please follow the agreement with Medic and Grand Vishur and fulfill the corresponding terms. As the Ice Prophet once again confirmed the talisman in the black-robed mage's hand, the two powerful elemental creatures that responded to the summons began their performance. The elemental pool made of ice elements stopped expanding, but its height skyrocketed. First, the thick icicles grew into the trunk, and on the trunk, branches of ice grew out. The swirling snowballs climbed to the top of the tree, filling the gaps between the branches like leaves. When this huge tree of ice and snow pierced into the clouds, apart from Keys, who insisted on admiring the magnificent scenery created by the spell, everyone in Medica's camp had to withdraw from the tree shade to avoid the bone-chilling cold. The power of the Ice Prophet gathered once again, and the canopy of the tree with snowflakes as leaves and icicles as branches suddenly boiled. The scene was like taking a bubble bath. As the bubbles made of snowflakes continued to burst, a large number of elemental creatures crawled out. One by one, little devils that looked like they were carved out of ice came to the people. But Keys, who was more familiar with the Batsu people, was not as ignorant as the country bumpkins of the material plane. He knew that these little guys with long noses and flapping wings were actually ice bats. These elemental creatures native to the ice elemental plane rushed into the sky under the guidance of their creators, while after being born from the tree of ice and snow. Tens of thousands of ice bats spread out and turned into condensed cores, gathering the water vapor in the sky around them. It didn't take long for the deliberately brewing blizzard to be completed. The wind carried the dark clouds, and the ice cores were mixed with snowflakes. Under the guidance of Medica's mages, the blizzard broke into the formation of the Japanese Sky Fortress. The soldiers on duty on the observation deck were wearing thick cotton clothes, but they were still shivering from the cold. The slaves working on the deck were also unable to work normally. Only the ships equipped with heating furnaces were in better condition. The raging flames brought enough heat. Under the strict orders of the commander, the soldiers on duty sped up the speed of sending coal into the furnaces. The airbags that suddenly shrunk urgently needed to be replenished with hot air. Otherwise, the airship formation would not be able to maintain its original altitude. Chapter 159. Captain, why are you blushing? I feel refreshed. Hirano, why is your face so yellow? Hey, this is the wax that I applied to protect myself from the cold. A few brave soldiers were climbing up and down the airbags on the airships using rope ladders. They were wrapped in cold-resistant clothing made of goat skin and wearing cotton boots. They were using wooden mallets and shovels to clean the ice on the surface of the airbags through mittens made of animal skin. This kind of work was actually very dangerous. Only the soldiers from Shrimp County could do it. They were the only ones who were not afraid of heights and could adapt to the cold at the same time. However, to ensure their safety, each soldier was connected with a safety rope to prevent them from being blown away by the wind. Oh, the wind is biting cold, just like the snow mountain in my hometown. Captain, you are really good at imagining things. If you ask me, this wind is like a whore's thigh, squeezing my thighs painfully. The soldiers kept arguing with each other in their native language. This was the only time when they were not controlled by the Japanese, and it was also the only way for them to cheer each other up and get through the difficult work. If the airship was compared to the legendary whale, then these shrimps were like the lice that lived on the beast's body. At this moment, the snowstorm that affected the whales made these parasites complain in their hearts. But this was just the beginning. The repeated invasions made the Métis very angry, so the snowstorm was naturally very fierce. Aside from the giant snow tree that Quest had witnessed its growth, the black-robed sorcerers from the academy had planted another 3 trees. Around the Sky Fortress group, formed by the Japanese airships, for giant ice trees that affected the weather rose one after another. With tens of thousands of ice demon bats as condensation cores, and with the instigation of the gas djinn, cloud giants, and other creatures, an unprecedented blizzard in the history of the Ash World formed a huge net. The Wusang airship was the prey that the net wanted to capture. However, some of the tribesmen in the desert became innocent fish caught in the crossfire. The snowstorm covered a wide area. Although the Japanese managed to avoid most of the cities in Medici, the tribesmen living in the desert were not so lucky. In an environment like the Ash World that was dry and short of water for a long time, a large amount of precipitation might not be a good rain. It could also be a fatal crisis. What's more, it wasn't rain that was falling from the sky, but heavy snow the size of goose feathers. The livestock raised by the desert elves and the old and weak in the tribe were the first to bear the brunt. A large number of them froze to death. The snowflakes that fell into the cracks between the stones froze and expanded. The stone tablet of history, which was a sacred object, also began to shatter. The remaining young adults could only slaughter animals to eat large amounts of meat, and they would gather together to light bonfires for warmth. When there was not enough firewood and camel dung, animal fat could only be used as fuel for the time being. Fortunately, the tribes that were slightly larger had already sent out their riders before the snow reached their ankles. They rode on all kinds of camel beasts and asked for help and support from the nearest Medici. By the time the news had passed through several hands and reached the hands of the black-robed mage who was controlling the weather, the blizzard had already been raging for a day. We have to make a choice now. In the temporary command tent, Marshal Medici, who was holding the disaster and loss reports, glanced at Keys. The latter just gave him an apologetic look. In fact, the young blue dragon did not expect the black-robed mages to carry out the plan so thoroughly. In his expectation, a large-scale flood relief was basically the worst-case scenario, but now, the situation was even worse. The commanders had to immediately make a choice between defeating the Japanese airships and killing tens of thousands of tribesmen nominally under Medici's rule. The Japanese have been trapped in the blizzard for a day, and their speed is now less than a quarter of their previous speed. According to the calculations of the intelligence officers and tactical staff officers, according to the situation, the coal they carry will be used up in about a day and a half. The marshal paused for a moment. But we also have a problem here. The places affected by the blizzard have experienced a large-scale frost disaster. Those cities are fine, but according to the latest information, some of the desert elves have died from the cold. His words were interrupted by another participant, who happened to be a pasha as well. The tribesmen who were affected by the disaster were living under his rule. In order to ensure that we could defeat the Japanese with the latest weapons, we have to endure these losses. Moreover, The dead cannot be brought back to life. If we let the Japanese escape after most of the desert elves have died, we will lose more than we gain. Why don't we continue with the original plan? As long as my accountant calculates the losses, I will report it to Pharaoh and ask for compensation. The first half of his speech was quite reasonable, but the second half revealed his true intentions. However, it also explained some problems. In the eyes of most Medici, the desert elves were just barbarians. It was not a pity that a group of them died. Some participants who had the same point of view also agreed with the Pasha's suggestion. Most of them were representatives sent by the governors of the cities nearby on the Japanese airship route. After seeing the power of the blizzard, they did not want a terrible blizzard to fall on their cities. Two merciful people could not lead troops to war. Although Marshal Medici was somewhat disdainful of the Pasha's words, he could not deny that the sacrifices that have been made should not be in vain was actually his true thought. As representatives of the academic black-robe mages, the mentors of Medici's magic research school did not consider the pros and cons at all. All their minds were immersed in the snow trees that they had planted in the distance. They were not only magical creations produced by the combination of spells of several other schools, but also the embryonic form of strategic spells in the Ash world. It wasn't their fault. In fact, Quest was also full of praise for the idea of this compound spell. Just like dominoes, the limited prayer of the Glabrizu, the weather-changing spells of the Cloud Giant and the Gas Djinn, the Ice Prophet's elemental pool talent, and the absolute control of elemental creatures like the Ice Demon Bat, a series of spells that could not be regarded as the highest level, after being arranged in an orderly manner, actually produced the effect of a chain reaction. The destructive power of the blizzard was even more than the sum of all the spells as the dominoes added together. Perhaps limited by the fixed thinking of team-running games in his previous life, Keyes' exploration of spells was still in the mode of learn, use, and learn again. He seemed to lack some ability to create new spells. Although he realized this problem, the reason why he hired the Demolic as his own spell consultant was because of his ability to invent new spells. Keyes still did not have any innovative ideas before seeing this compound spell. Unlike the casting method similar to the corruption spell, mastered by the mages in the Ash world, Megalosaurus actually appeared in many worlds as stowaways or colonizers. Megalosaurus was born with the ability to communicate with the mysterious source of the multiverse to release spells. This made Megalosaurus have fewer restrictions when using spells, but it also developed a bad habit of taking things from others. The reason why the old dragon Sirota was forced to participate in the Blood War by the evil Dragon Council through the Bloodline contract was that the other party took a fancy to his magic ability, which was different from the ordinary legendary Megalosaurus. This could be seen from the fact that he could remodel Disintegrate and Mage's Disjunction on his own. Originally, Keyes only planned to start learning more supreme magic skills step by step after the growth of his magic power reached a bottleneck. However, the compound spell of the Black Robe Mages of Medici and the chain reaction that followed gave him a lot of inspiration. He wanted to immediately dive into his own research, but at the moment, he had to solve the problem in front of him. Megalosaurus Pasha, it was your plan to weaken the power of the Japanese airships. So far, the blizzard has indeed affected the performance of the enemy's new weapons. So what do you suggest next? Marshal Medici's words interrupted Keyes' thoughts about magic research, but he did not show any displeasure. As for the problem of how to deal with the Japanese airships, the young blue dragon had already come up with a plan. The Blitzkrieg response was nothing more than finding a way to slow down the lightning strike and then continue to consume it. However, if the enemy launched such a military assault on land, they could also use strategic depth to set up small forts or superior forces to launch a counter-assault to wear down the enemy's spirit. However, the Japanese's assault relied on airships, and Medici did not have the means to set up small defensive forts in the sky. Using the existing forces that could fight in the air, such as the vulture riders and wyverns, to launch a counter-assault would be like hitting a rock with an egg. Therefore, the only way was to lure the airships to attack secondary targets. As long as they could seize the opportunity when the airships would be relatively stationary during the attack, they might be able to cause the airships to crash. If we can figure out that the airships lack coal as fuel, then the Japanese must have guessed the purpose of the blizzard. Under such circumstances, a normal commander would choose to plunder a coal source to replenish his energy. However, in their opinion, this will most likely lead to them falling into our trap. So, I guess the Japanese army will risk everything and launch a surprise attack on Medici's mages' camp. After saying this, the young blue dragon, who was in human form, drew his scythe sword and slashed downward. What we need to do is to settle things with them here. Chapter 160. Unlike the free swordsmen who had a few fights due to physical discomfort after ascending into the air, the disciplined duty slave warriors remained obedient as usual. They drank oatmeal mixed with salted dried fruit and waited for their master's latest orders at the bottom of the cabin. The blizzard seemed to be getting worse. Except for the damage control soldiers who had to climb up the airbags using rope ladders to break the ice and the lookouts who were on duty around the clock, there were almost no soldiers walking on the deck. The young combat staff officers were arguing in the command room at the stern of the general's flagship. The mage's prophecy has revealed the location of the Medici. They are affecting the climate not far from the fleet. We are short of coal. The maximum sailing distance is not enough to reach Bite City. We have to find a place to replenish. That's just the data obtained from the sextant and various tables. We have to use our long guns and short cannons to verify it. The general himself was the one who ended the argument. The tall silver warrior pulled out the dragonfly cutter and threw it casually into the sand table where the Medici mages were gathered. Then let's fight. We'll know after the fight. With the help of the eagle and the magic communication device, the battle plan issued by the staff office was quickly implemented. Every officer in the Sky Fortress began to carry out their respective tasks. The navigator changed the course of the airship according to the marked air chart. Ambassador Ku carefully checked every weapon that was transported out of the warehouse. The supervisor used a whip to urge the slaves to gather at the rehearsed positions. The damage control team leader began to focus on the situation around the furnace. Mercury vapor rose in the staff office. The initiator of the blizzard, the giant snow trees that reached into the clouds, stood on top of it. The Japanese mages took out the 6-Ren-style disc and repeatedly deduced. They had to ensure that the fleet's target was not a camouflage created by illusions. The blizzard began to develop to an unpredictable degree. It became more and more difficult to use the eagle to communicate. The situation of the damage control team was getting worse. Casualties began to occur while carrying out the task of cleaning the airbags. The situation of the airship was not optimistic. The propellers driven by mules and horses had been loaded to the maximum power. These huge sky fortresses were still dispirited in the turbulence. It wasn't that the commander hadn't thought of raising the airship to a higher altitude where the airflow was calm, but because the airbags had frozen after the snowfall, the volume of air displaced and the lift force had been greatly reduced. However, they firmly believed that this advanced weapon, which was ahead of its time, will be able to withstand the strong winds and break through the dark clouds. As long as the airships were piloted above the Medici's camp, their power would make those people feel despair. All the final preparations related to the attack were being carried out in full swing. The beast slave who was in charge of raising the beast was trying his best to throw the dried figs in his hand at the darts. He had to be careful not to be bitten by these little things, and he also had to be careful not to cut his fingers by the sharp iron nails and the dried figs. A large number of do-die slave warriors gathered on the landing deck. While they were lining up tightly for warmth, they had to repeatedly check if the rope buckles and pulleys on themselves and their teammates were tight. Soon, they would have to rely on these things to save their lives. Right now, the freelance swordsman team was also fully prepared. Right now, they were all gathered around the vice captain. During the air raid, the vice captain would tear up the mass feather false spell scroll given by the mages. They would arrive after the slave warriors. The gunners operating the special national cannon were the most nervous at this moment because they were the busiest in the preparation work. In addition to repeatedly cleaning the cannon chamber and arranging the ammunition, they also had to seize the time to flip through the adjustment manual to quickly review the parabolic landing points of different distances after firing the cannonballs from different altitudes. Diligent work would always be rewarded, and the Japanese seemed to have some good luck. When the airships flew through the stormy clouds in the wild goose formation, the scorching sunlight in the west penetrated the dark clouds and sprinkled down from the sky. On the snow-covered mountain peak in the distance, the last ray of sunlight shone like a pearl. The long shadow cast by the peak of the mountain drew everything at the foot of the mountain into darkness. Only the icicle trunks, shining with the same scorching sunlight, were so dazzling. In the setting sun, a large number of shiny fairies flapped their wings and flew toward the airship fortress. They were the ice demon bats that had received the order to attack. At this moment, they launched a group attack with the greatest malice and brutality at the Japanese. The first to react were the darts that came out of their nests. These war beasts that were full of iron nails rushed out of their cages and pounced on the ice demon bats under the guidance of the red searchlights. Darts versus ice demon bats. Both sides of the battle let out disgusting screams and attacked each other with spitting weapons. The iron nails that came out of the darts' stomachs turned into bullets, and a single accurate shot was enough to shatter the ice demon bats into pieces. The frost breath of the ice demon bats could also easily freeze their opponents into ice cubes. After the elemental creatures died, their corpses would explode, and the ice shards that splashed out would turn into deadly blades. However, this battle was a battle of numbers. The Japanese had to thank the beast slaves for feeding them a sufficient number of darts. The airship had locked onto the target. The formation of the flying geese changed into a two-column formation and encircled the mages' camp from both sides, tightly encircling them. The commanders had yet to give the order to lower the altitude so that the warriors could land. They were determined to show their opponents the deepest horror. The cannons began to fire, but each column could only fire from one side of the porthole. The cannoneers braced themselves and no longer cared if the angle of the cannons was correct or not. They were ordered to pour out all the cannonballs they received from Ambassador Ku. The cannonballs rumbled from the sky and smashed into the mages' camp. Some of the cannonballs even exploded in the air before they hit the ground, turning into iron scraps that shot out into the air. The solid cannonballs, on the other hand, had an amazing impact with the potential energy of gravity. The defensive spells on the ground were often smashed into pieces after flashing for a moment. Under such carpet bombing, the ballistas that were originally covered by illusion could no longer be hidden. Some of the Metuchi ballistas tried to shoot heavy spears at the enemy, but the airship had not yet descended to a low enough altitude, and the range of the ballistas was not enough. When the camp was basically reduced to dust, the remaining mages retreated to the surroundings of the giant snow tree. They worked together to support a protective spell against the cannonballs. It seemed that they were going to defend this weather weapon against the airship with their lives. Several clay golems drilled out of the ambush holes and hugged together, turning into the base guards of the giant tree's branches. The wall of gnawing teeth, summoned by the master of incantation, rose from the ground to block the giant tree's perimeter. Mysterious runes flashed and turned into several giant force field fists, constantly attacking the cannonballs. The Japanese airships changed their attack pattern again. Like butterflies flying through flowers, the two-column formation became a single-column formation. Below each airship, rows of holes were exposed at the bottom of several airships that were connected in series. Pieces of pottery that looked like large flower pots were exposed from the holes. Each of them was more than 10 feet tall. The top was sealed with paraffin, and there was a vertical pole more than 20 feet long inserted at the bottom. Below the vertical pole was an additional base. When the airships flew in a straight line above the snow, these big guys fell one by one. Due to the problem of the center of gravity, they maintained a vertical falling posture. When a vertical pole hit the ground or other obstacles, it triggered the piston. The paraffin at the top exploded and liquid splashed out. Then the piston triggered the igniter, and the liquid burned, dancing wildly in the air. When the flame came into contact with something in the pot, the whole pot was detonated. The explosive contained some kind of silver-white metal powder. When mixed with the alchemy potion, the flame was so bright that it was difficult to look at it directly. The wall of gnawing teeth that protected the giant snow tree was reduced to ashes in a few breaths. Even the clay golems could not directly face the high temperature of the alchemy flame. Many parts of their bodies directly turned into lava. The force field fist did not help at all. The broken pots in the air covered a larger area of the deadly flame. Sure enough, art is explosion. Keyes muttered to himself, standing on the airship's observation deck. Chapter 161. Because they were worried that the flying wings would not be able to fly stably in the strong wind, the Tengu tribe was not arranged to join the first wave of attack on Medica's mage camp. But now that the bad weather was under control, these impatient fellows jumped off the airship. Their mission now was to help the Japanese troops land safely. Breathing in the smoky air after a fierce artillery bombardment, the patriarch of the Tengu clan loved this strange, sweet smell. It was the perfect enjoyment to look down at the earth from the sky. The wingless Japanese soldiers carefully slid down the ropes or landed on the ground under the effect of the group featherfall technique. Watching some of them turn pale because of their fear of heights, the patriarch of the Tengu clan felt a sense of relief. The ballista on the airship fired a large number of bolts with ropes to the ground. The trained crossbowmen skillfully controlled the angle between the ropes and the ground. The angle could not be too big, or people would fall to their deaths if they slid down. It could not be too small, or people would become live targets if they stayed in the air for too long. In addition, they had to make sure that the ropes were slack and not too tight. This was the landing method of the Do-Dai warriors. They put a quick descent rope with stone pulleys and friction knots on this rope, and quickly slid down one by one. As for the free swordsmen, they naturally received better treatment. The warriors gathered around the captain. Their captain tore open the group feather fall spell scroll given by the mages and jumped down from the deck of the airship with all the members. The next part was interesting. The free swordsmen had to supervise each other. No one was allowed to stay on the deck for any reason. During the process of falling, they also had to be alert and look around to see if anyone was falling head first. This was not uncommon. People who fell from high places were likely to lose their sense of direction of gravity, especially when some people closed their eyes because of their fear of heights. Once this happened, the people around had to correct it. After all, the feather fall spell could not prevent the death of a broken neck. But overall, the landing of the Japanese troops went smoothly. A total of 20 teams of free swordsmen and more slave warriors quickly landed in Medica's mage camp. After the previous bombardment, the defensive position built with magic had been razed to the ground. Long craters and raging flames had become the main theme of this place. The Japanese soldiers were divided into small groups and charged toward the giant snow tree in the center of the camp. Do-Dai's slave warriors were still the vanguard to prevent any spell traps that might not have been triggered. This was not because they were overly cautious. Magic traps, such as explosive runes buried deep underground and an acid magic ball that could only be activated under certain circumstances, were discovered one after another. After sacrificing the lives of nearly 100 slave warriors, the Japanese finally gathered around the giant snow tree. Due to the airship's continuous bombardment, the elemental pools beneath the ice and snow diviners had shrunk to less than 200 feet in radius. Although the coldness was still pressing, it was no longer as bone-chilling as before. The commander of the Free Swordsman team was very smart. He did not choose to use the lives of Do-Dai's slave warriors to pave a path through the ice barrier. The flag-bearer quickly waved the triangular flag in his hand with yellow and red fluorescent colors. He was sending orders to the Tengu team in the air. The commander of the Japanese alliance was ready to let the Tengu throw falling flame strike at the marked targets. As the sky darkened, the archers shot arrows with special small canisters. The red phosphorus inside the canisters burned, marking the targets for the Tengu. At the same time, To prevent Medica's mages from interfering with the spells, the commander of the Japanese alliance also let the grenadiers use small ballistas to throw alchemy bombs into the barrier. The sound of the explosions kept ringing. The trained soldiers used their arms to cover their eyes to avoid the blinding flashes. The Tengu's falling flame strike accurately hit all the marked targets. They used all kinds of voices to praise their great achievements in the air. The incendiary bombs containing white phosphorus burned through the snow on the surface of the elemental pools. The ice underground slowly melted into small pools. The power of ice and snow, which could repair itself, seemed to be unable to stop the destruction. If it weren't for the fact that the staff officer wanted to explore the secrets of this strategic spell, he would have ordered them to capture as many medic spellcasters as possible. Seeing that the enemy was at the end of their rope, the commander of the Japanese alliance even thought about ordering the Tengu team to burn through their last hiding place. However, his optimism did not last long. The falling flame strike was actually the continuous heat release process of the white phosphorus incendiary bombs. It filled the elemental pools with steam, and new elemental creatures were summoned. The steam bats were born from the boiling pools. Like the ice bats, they were also elemental creatures. Although the steam bats were not as cruel as the ice bats, they were more domineering and sensitive by nature. The bubbling sound of the boiling water covered the hissing sound of their wings flapping. The night and the steam above the elemental pools made their translucent bodies even harder to see. The heavenly hounds with wings on their backs were making a lot of noise in the sky, which made the steam ogre bat even angrier. They were like real imps as they viciously pounced on their opponents, spitting boiling steam onto their opponents' faces. Some of the Tengu and the Japanese soldiers on the ground were hit by the steam bats. The unlucky ones with steamed faces were immediately attacked by the steam bats. What was worse was that their claws were often aimed at the blisters on the victims' faces. For a moment, the whole place was filled with screams. Of course, the steam bats were not completely immune to attacks. Although their bodies were translucent, they were still solid. Whether it was swords, axes, or shields, they could hurt the steam bats. The soldiers who were being attacked launched a counterattack, and the steam bats were constantly being chopped into pieces. Similar to the ice bats, these elemental creatures would find a way to deal the final blow to their enemies after they died. The dead steam bats turned into hot steam clouds. If the soldiers within 5 feet of them were not agile enough and could not jump away in time, they would face the danger of being scalded again. The sudden attack of the steam bats caused a commotion among the Japanese soldiers on the ground. The commanders on the airships kept trying to communicate with the wing commander on the ground, reminding him to change tactics. However, they did not know that the real danger was gathering above their heads. A fireball was launched from the observation deck of one of the airships. It flew higher into the sky and turned into a firework that lit up the night sky. A large number of flying carpets swooped down from the clouds. Each flying carpet was driven by a sorcerer. Some noble sorcerers in black robes even took on the role of pilot. At the moment, the passengers on the flying carpets were a large number of ordinary soldiers dressed as Medici soldiers. This was the final counterattack in Keyes' plan. The snowstorm had weakened the airship's ability to lift, preventing it from ascending any higher. Therefore, they could not see the ambush on the clouds in advance. Thanks to the 1,000-year accumulation of the Medici Empire, flying carpets were expensive magic creations. Although it was not necessary for every sorcerer to have a flying carpet, it was not a problem to assemble hundreds of them in a short time. After the bombing, the Japanese soldiers landed on the airships. Not only did they lower their flying altitude again, but they also lacked enough soldiers to defend the airships. The plan gradually turned the situation around. The airships no longer had the advantage of being a fortress in the sky. The chaos caused by the steam bats sounded the horn of counterattack. The agreed fireball spell was the signal to open the gate. Medici's flying carpets were like the water of the Milky Way. They tore apart the camouflage of the night sky and poured down on the airships. The elite warriors untied the beaks of the patrolling eagles on their shoulder armor. The elite war beasts provided by the sorcerers turned into a black cloud and swept toward the enemies below. The war beasts were responsible for harassment, the sorcerers were responsible for driving, and the warriors were responsible for destruction. A team of 10 warriors on a flying carpet jumped off the flying carpets at the same time when the flying carpets were close to the airbags of the airships. They lit torches, drew their swords, and hacked at the airbags under their feet. Although the outer layer of the airbags was very sturdy, these demolishers gradually mastered the technique. One of them used a spear to poke out rows of small holes, while the other two grabbed their machetes and tore at the airbags using the small holes. Seeing that the enemy was wantonly destroying the airbags, the soldiers were scared out of their wits. They wanted to stop it, but they were harassed by the patrolling eagles when they climbed up the rope ladder. Their faces were scratched by the eagles' claws, and their eyes were pecked blind by the eagles' beaks. They fell down the rope ladder and died in horror. The sorcerers of the Japanese army were ready to fight back, but they were attacked by the sorcerers of Medici. After unloading the soldiers on the flying carpets, the sorcerers gathered in groups of 3 to 5 and fought the airships with their numbers and mobility. According to the strategy discussed in advance, the sorcerers in black robes were the core of Medici's army, and the sorcerers in gray robes were the support. The sorcerers in gray robes were responsible for casting powerful offensive spells, while the sorcerers in gray robes were responsible for defending against different types of spells. Division of labor symbolizes order, and order is power. This proverb from the Batsid Devil once again proved that the people in the lower world had foresight. The battle ended with the fall of the first airship. At the same time, the Sky Fortress, which had destroyed a large number of airbags, was directly defeated by gravity. The airships formed by the Japanese noble army were destroyed one after another. Any mortal who fell from thousands of feet could only scream helplessly and painfully. Only a few Japanese spellcasters managed to escape back to the flagship airships, which were suspended in the air by the anti-gravity magic circle. The Medici warriors also used mass feather drop to land on top of the airbags. After they finished their demolition work, they immediately launched an assault on the Japanese ground forces that were dumbfounded. One side was full of morale, while the other side was frightened. The result was obvious at the beginning of the battle. Not to mention, a large number of soldiers emerged from the ridge behind the sorcerers' camp and joined the battle. The sorcerers had dug a hideout in advance, and an elite army from the northern port city was hiding in it. Compared to the battle on the ground, the battle in the sky was more complicated. Some airships, with their good mobility, were still fighting with the sorcerers who were driving the flying carpets. However, when Keys and Snade, the half-lich, appeared on the airship belonging to the general, the resistance became futile. However, the result of this cloud-top game was really surprising. A cicada shedding its carapace, or abandoning the pawn to protect the chariot. When Keys personally led the way to the general staff room, he did not know whether it was because he did not silently pray for the blessing of Chicken Bro, but when he cleared the level, he found that the boss was actually just for show. The silver samurai armor in the staff room was easily squashed by the giant force field hand. Obviously, the equipment dropped was also fake. Chapter 162. Everyone has a castle at the bottom of their hearts. This castle often imprisons extremely private secrets and fears. You can't expect an iron gate to guard it firmly. Even a cast iron gate may not be able to do so. Smart people choose to use virtue and self-esteem as guards, while less smart people often choose contracts and spells as gatekeepers. But whether the owner of the castle is smart enough or not, he should know the importance of the castle. After all, this is a moving castle. If you're not careful, it will lead people across the border of the camp. Alan's diary, written by Medica's past Grand Vexillers. Medic, the broken halberd of the noble coalition army of the Senate, had not yet spread to Yun City. Only a few people in Japan had learned of this information in advance. After experiencing the Great Fire in Huan City, the citizens needed to put more energy into bargaining with the vendors at this time. Houses had to be rebuilt, food had to be bought, and life had to go on. But only God knows where all the good and cheap goods in the past have gone. It must have been those black-hearted merchants who wanted to profit from the disaster. Due to the development of trade, not only Japan, but also the merchants of the entire Ashes world wanted to move their products to Yun City. At that time, prices were naturally very cheap. But now, in just a few days, a few bushels of grain cost a silver coin. But even so, the merchants did not make much of a bargain. The extra taxes brought by the city's reconstruction drained the pockets of the merchant class. Except for the nobles who did not need to pay taxes, all the merchants in Yun City were planning to sell the property here. At this time, the notary office did not have to worry about business. Keep it well. This is the transfer contract with immediate effect. The well-dressed notary handed the scroll with the magic seal to the buyer with a warm smile on his face. It was a big deal. He, who had earned a generous commission, enthusiastically said to the foreign merchant in front of him, "You have a good eye. Yun City has only encountered a small crisis. After the new city is rebuilt, this sewage canal cleaning house will definitely make a lot of money every day." After a simple greeting with the notary, Commander Wenfeng, who had disguised himself, walked out of the notary office. Make a lot of money every day? How is that possible? The cleaning house, which made money by collecting cleaning fees and was responsible for the disposal of the underground sewage canal in Yun City, was barely operating even before the fire. The purchase of this kind of pickled fish for a living was entirely due to the fact that the cleanup area was sufficiently secluded. Walking through the alley outside the notary office, Commander Wenfeng thought about the next two things he needed to do. The staff didn't need to be replaced because the sniffer had already replaced every position inside. He also needed to go to the registration office to register the new facility. This was also the reason why he bought the management rights of the cleanup center. After the fire, Yun City gave preferential treatment to the merchants who rebuilt the buildings and facilities. Previously, many of the materials that could not be purchased due to overage issues had been relaxed. Just as he was planning his work arrangements, two squeaks suddenly entered Commander Wenfeng's ears. He turned his head and saw that a messenger lizard with suction cups on its feet had climbed onto his shoulder without him noticing. Ever since the Grand Vader met with the first Allen, the soul-binding sorcerer called Shurik, many chimeras with various functions had appeared around him. The messenger lizard was one of them. The greatest ability of this kind of chimera was that it could repeat human speech and then secretly run to the recipient's ear to pass on a secret message: "The pickaxe will be ready tomorrow morning. Make sure it's ready tonight." After saying this, the messenger lizard stuck out its tongue and quickly licked Commander Wenfeng's earlobe. This was not a pet acting coquettishly. This was the chimera indicating that the message had been sent and at the same time asking for postage. It took out a handful of fried locusts from one of its pockets and left it alone after feeding it. After this little thing had its fill, it would quietly leave. The Grand Vader's plan was nearing its end, and at this time, he still had a lot of work to do. Yun City was located above a city, or rather, there was another city under Yun City. This city, which had been abandoned for more than 600 years, was called Yun City. The real meaning of the name was actually the city that was placed on top of Yun City. And there was a secret hidden in Yun City, a secret that needed to be kept by the chairman of the Senate and the general. The chairman of the council led the group into the underground city through a secret passage. Only a few magicians and his personal guards were following him. Because it had been abandoned for too long, there were already dilapidated walls inside. And these dilapidated walls were now an important part of Yun City's underground drainage system. If the Senate's meeting hall was compared to Yun City's brain, then the underground drainage system was definitely the city's rectum. Headless rats, burnt building materials, swollen animal carcasses, human and animal feces. You could think of any kind of garbage in this city, but they were all floating in the underground sewer with a layer of turbid floating matter. All kinds of strong and unfamiliar smells assailed the nostrils. It was as if they could even taste it in their mouths. The chairman tried his best to push this disgusting thought out of his mind. He knew that the mages had used the head bubble spell to summon a breathable air filter and put on everyone's head. but the feeling of nausea reminded him that this place was not a place to stay for long. All the known entrances to this underground city, except for the secret passage in the Senate's meeting hall, were firmly welded shut by thick cast iron plates. In order to hide its existence, Yin City had strict regulations on the amount of earth that could be transported out during the construction of houses. This was to prevent people from digging too deep into the ground and causing unnecessary trouble. Of course, these measures were also a form of protection. After all, in addition to the secrets deliberately hidden by the chairman and the general, there were many unknown dangers in the ruins of Yin City. Many of the demons and ghosts in the stories of mortals actually lived in this underground city that fell from the clouds. At this time, this adventure team did not light a torch or summon the eternal flame. Firstly, there was a lot of methane in the air here. Secondly, too bright a light might attract uninvited guests. Originally, the mages were prepared to add night vision to everyone, but because the accompanying warriors and the chairman could not adapt to this way of perception, they had to use fluorescent algae filled in glass bottles as a light source. But even this dim green light attracted many terrifying monsters during the process of moving forward. The mutated itter monsters that herded giant pus spiders, the troglodyte monsters that hid in the dilapidated walls, waiting for an opportunity to attack, and the wraiths that occupied the ancient city. In the process of moving forward in just half an hourglass, the chairman had lost more than 10 of his personal guards. Thanks to the mages who were guarding by his side, they were able to avoid danger time and time again. Damn it, why aren't they back yet? Chapter 163. Since the establishment of Izumo City, the speaker had only stepped into the ruins of Yunqing twice. Every time, when the Neon Empire was facing a major crisis, he was personally escorted by the general himself. But when he entered the place for the third time, he had no choice but to let others follow him. Now, other than recalling the steps of his first two operations, his mind was full of how to do it without leaving any traces behind. With the help of the weak green light emitted by the fluorescent algae, the personal guards once again worked together to kill a mutant itter monster. In this dirty and muddy underground city, who knew how many spider herders who raised eight-legged shepherds were hiding? The indefensible spider silk trap cut a personal guard's finger, and it swelled up like a carrot in a short while. Two more people were even worse. Although they were protected by armor, they were bitten by the mutant itter monster and the giant pus spiders raised by it, and they were poisoned to death. We should be there soon, the Speaker of the Senate thought to himself. In his memory, the last time he came here, he also encountered a large number of mutant itters who were building nests. These monsters were once small pets of a certain existence, and now they were the main source of food for its descendants. As the team moved forward, the sewage level under their feet gradually lowered. The terrain became a little higher, and when they stepped on the raised stone slabs, their feet were not as muddy as before. Not long after, they came to a double-arched bridge. There was a towering inscription on the bridge. The words Imperial House of Kamatachi were originally engraved on it, but at this time, it had been cut out with a sharp weapon. With the help of the light emitted by the fluorescent algae, everyone could vaguely see the dark and gloomy buildings behind the double-arched bridge. From time to time, some muffled roars of monsters could be heard from there. A mage took out a secret snake from the magic pet's pocket, lowered his head, and whispered a few words to the magic pet. After receiving the master's order, the secret snake sneaked into the dark shadows beyond the illumination range of the fluorescent algae. The master of the magic pet closed his eyes slightly. If one looked carefully through the slit of his eyes, one would find that his eyeballs had become vertical pupils similar to a snake's. At this time, he was sharing senses with the secret snake to scout ahead. The magic pet that had been modified by magic was not just an ordinary animal. The secret snake not only moved much faster than ordinary snakes, it could even snake forward on the walls. With his infrared vision and keen sense of touch, the obstacles in the dark could not stop him at all. After passing through the double arch bridge, Lin Sanjiu saw a torii that was connected into an arched corridor. However, Not only were the paint of these ancient Japanese buildings peeling off, but most of them had also collapsed on the side of the road. Suddenly, it heard heavy footsteps, and a few red humanoid figures appeared in its infrared vision. These figures were clearly not humans. This was because even though the thermal radiation would make the outlines of creatures appear larger in infrared vision, the figures of those people would appear too tall. It turned out to be a crude giant. When these creatures walked past the collapsed torii, the secret art of swimming snake was finally able to clearly see their appearances after switching its visual perception. They carried huge wooden clubs on their shoulders. The familiar and its master finally understood where the missing parts of the torii had gone. Each of the wooden clubs was slightly longer than the combined height of two normal humans. From time to time, the ugly giants were communicating with each other, and the spies hiding at the side were carefully listening to their conversation. Although most of their words were in the Jotun language, there were some ancient Japanese words mixed in. We collect more spider people roast and eat. We collect morettes, roast and eat. Excellent. Excellent spider stew is not delicious. Okay, spider stew is not delicious. Understanding the conversation of the ugly giants that was shared through the familiar's ears, the mage finally understood why they had encountered so many mutated ets building their nests along the way. Perhaps he felt that the voices he heard had become softer, so he slowly controlled the familiar to move closer a little. With a whoosh, the mage suddenly felt as if his head had been flipped over with a big stick, and the connection between him and the secret snake was instantly cut off. The crude giant had actually discovered his magic pet. This was definitely the result of the mage's carelessness when learning monstrumology knowledge. As a type of giant, about the third from the bottom in terms of overall strength, slightly stronger than the two-headed giants and the hill giants, the ugly giants had good perception and insight. It was precisely because of this that they who were used to moving in underground caves were difficult to be ambushed by enemies. The range of the secret snake's snooping was still a little too large, so it was discovered and beaten flat. Although the mage, who had been sharing senses with the familiar, was not injured, he still felt the same as the familiar. Enduring the dizziness of a concussion, he described his discovery to his companions while trying to sort out the spells that he had memorized before. The ugly giants had obviously discovered them, and a battle was inevitable. Do not use lethal spells or cut off the heads of those guys. When everyone was preparing, the Speaker of the Senate sternly reminded them, just knock those guys out, or there will be big trouble. Remember, this is an order. The Speaker's words were very puzzling. When they were clearing the monsters that blocked the way, he did not give any orders, but the mages and guards still habitually expressed that they would obey the will of the ruler of the Neon Empire. Some of the guards took out leather pads under their armor to cover the edges of their weapons, and some directly took off their scabbards and sheathed their weapons. The mages' preparations were more complicated. They had to change the positions of some of the spells that they had memorized, such as Chain Lightning and Group Monster Immobilization spell. The ugly giants reacted faster than expected. The mages who had lost their familiars only saw two giants, but now they had summoned more of their companions. Fortunately, although these monsters were difficult to deal with, they did not have any long-range attacks. Due to their deformed bodies, they were unable to throw boulders like other giants. However, when fighting in close range, they still had to be careful of their curse of the evil eye. When the mages looked into their ugly almond-yellow eyes, their innate curse ability would be triggered, and the person who was cursed would have a certain chance of being deformed like them. Therefore, before the ugly giants rushed over, the mages cast protective spells on everyone that could resist their malevolent deformations. The personal guards of the Speaker were all one in 10,000 Japanese warriors. Even in the face of huge monsters, they decisively launched a counterattack. The ugly giants were probably the ugliest and most vicious kind of giants. Their heads were full of lumps, and they had uncoordinated facial features. Some of their limbs were also of different sizes and shapes. The breaths that came out of their deformed mouths and noses turned into horrifying howls. If it were not for the Speaker's strict order, The personal guard would have killed them with their swords so that they could deal with these ugly creatures as soon as possible. However, due to the order, they could only try their best to use edgeless weapons to injure the enemies. But it was actually not easy. The height of the head of an ordinary human could only reach the thighs of the ugly giants. The Japanese warriors could only choose a few places to attack, such as the Achilles tendon, the knee socket, and the crotch. At the same time, they had to stay alert and be careful not to be hit by the giant club. There were less than 30 personal guards of the speaker left, but there were 10 ugly giants in this nest. According to the nature of these monsters, they would come out in full force when fighting, so there should be no need to worry about them. However, on average, 3 people had to deal with one ugly giant. For humans, the chance of winning was actually very slim. Fortunately, they had the help of the mages. When the Japanese warriors were fighting under the giant's crotch, the mages did not stay idle either. Buff spells were constantly cast on the warriors, while buff spells were constantly cast on the giant's head. Originally, the best way to deal with these deformed giants was to kill them with powerful spells. Ugly giants were still giants. Their bodies were much stronger than other creatures, and they were not afraid of ordinary physical attacks. Although the warriors attacked their weak points, such as the Achilles tendon and other weak points, their weapons were not sharpened. After a long time, none of the giants fell down. However, the mages also obeyed the will of the Speaker of the Senate, so they had to find another way. When some enchantment spells did not work, they chose to use illusionary spells to exhaust the opponent's energy and then plan slowly. Under the effect of the illusionary spell, the number of human warriors in the eyes of the ugly giants began to change. More and more little bugs appeared under their feet. After waving the big stick and hitting the target, although the illusionary spell was broken, the warriors found the opportunity to hit the monster's heel hard at the same time. Some of the ugly giants suddenly roared in panic as they fought. This was the effect of the illusionary spell, because the human warriors in the eyes of the ugly giants would take off their disguise and become the drows or spirit suckers that the creatures living in the underground world hated the most. These illusionary spells were indeed effective. The ugly giants who were affected even had the intention to retreat. "You useless things, cheer up." One of the monsters suddenly roared in ancient Japanese. "It's just a little trick. What's there to be afraid of? We are the kings here, the kings of this underground city." The roar spread far and wide in the empty underground space. The rugged giant who made this roar was standing at the end of the double-arched bridge, using the big club in his hand to hit the heads of the deserters who were trying to escape from his tribe. Different from the other ugly giants, his body seemed to be more well-proportioned, and the stick in his hand was not a wooden stick made from the pillars of the torii, but a scepter in the shape of a hupak scepter. Hupak staff. Someone in the shadows behind the Japanese man smiled in understanding. Some of them immediately used sound wave spells to attack the ugly giant leader. This spell required a long chant, so they had only just finished preparing. The other mages loudly reminded the warriors in front of them to retreat quickly. Together, they cast spider web on the shabby giants. A large number of invisible and colorless magic threads emerged from the ground and the air. Being entangled by them was like falling into a sticky mud pit. This spell generally needed to be combined with the dark spell that obstructed vision in order to exert its greatest effect. However, because the crude giant had dark vision, not only infrared vision, but infrared vision could not see through the darkness formed by the spell, it could only be used alone. However, it seemed that it was enough. First, nearly 10 mages cast spiderweb at the same time, and the layers of magic threads piled up produced a stronger adhesive force. Second, in the battle just now, the shabby giants were tortured by the illusion and consumed a lot of energy. The combination of the two made it difficult for these aberrated giants to break free from the range of the spell. They could only let out futile roars, and at the same time, slowly pulled down by the magic threads and fell to the ground one by one. The spider silk summoned by the spell was not a physical entity, and there was a time limit. when the shabby giants fell to the ground. A few warriors who were enchanted with the grease spell immediately stepped forward and slapped the heads of the shabby giants with their leather-wrapped blades, quickly knocking them out. Leaving them aside, the shabby giant leader who was taken care of by the mages was now in great pain. Although the strength of the sound wave spell was precisely controlled, and his internal organs were not shattered by the sound wave, the feeling of his internal organs being displaced was not pleasant. He weakly waved the hupak staff in his hand, trying to drive away the human bugs that were trying to get close to him. However, the fascius in his muscles were also damaged, and his movements were weak. Sleep spell. After dealing with the other shabby giants, several mages stepped forward and cast spells on the giant leader. The repeated accumulation of the power of the spell finally broke the dam of chi built by willpower. Sleepiness poured down like a flood, and even closed his eyelids at the same time. A mage used the Tansun floating disc to lift up the shabby giant leader, and the captain of the guards acted as a guard. The two of them, under the instruction of the president, followed closely behind and walked into the collapsed palace, or the giant camp. The others were ordered to guard this place to the death. Double arch bridge, Torii corridor, in front of the imperial palace. Silently reciting these names that once existed, the president of the Senate strode forward and walked through the ruins at this time. When he walked to a place in memory, he stopped and said to himself, "Endless sky." When he said this sentence, the president was standing at the center of the giant camp. Peeled, barbecued spiders' hard shells, some monster bones with obvious bite marks, sleeping blankets made of rawhide, and so on, things that were completely unrelated to the Neon Empire's royal treasury, were scattered everywhere. The president took out a small jade bowl and a jade knife, and walked to the shabby giant chief who was in a coma. "Tie this monster up, the kind that will never break free without my permission." The mage nodded. A slithering snake crawled out of his sleeve and coiled around the giant's body. The snake's head also bit the snake's tail, forming a lock in the shape of a tail, swallowing snake. As the wizard silently chanted a few incantations, dense runes appeared on the snake rope. This time, it was the president's turn to nod. However, the president seemed to have suddenly thought of something. He turned around and picked up a monster bone that had been eaten clean from the ground. And then, with disgust, he asked the captain of the guards to open the mouth of the shabby giant chief and personally stuff the bone in. After all the preparation work, he ordered the two people accompanying him to turn around, and the latter obediently did so. The president held the jade knife in his hand, aimed at the shabby giant's right eye, and fiercely gouged it out. The body that had been nourished by the vitality of slaves for hundreds of years was still so strong, and the jade knife easily pierced the giant's eyelid. However, because the giant woke up from pain and tried to break free, the shaking on Tansun's floating disc affected his wrist. Fortunately, before piercing the eyeball, the president used his other hand to fix the wrist holding the knife, and stuck it close to the eye socket and completely pried out the giant's right eye. "Turn around, don't look back." The pain of losing the eye made the shabby giant bite the monster bones stuffed in his mouth, and let out a meaningless roar. The mage and the guard were just about to turn around to see if they needed help, but under the angry roar, they remained standing in the same position. The president was angry that he didn't find a harder bone, but on second thought, this shabby giant's roar could be used as a cover for his next operation. "Az Byrak Phobalaka, Su Tanya's myobia. Your voice through me." Note 1. An ancient whisper gently sounded in this space, and an incorporeal human head poked out from the ground. Its face was that of a handsome man with sharp edges, but it was missing an eye. This was the image of the first emperor of the Wozang Empire, the One-Eyed King. The president held the jade bowl with the giant's eyeball and put it into the missing eye socket of the One-Eyed King. Schleck. Light. Note 2. A dazzling gate appeared in midair. Just the golden color of the gate alone seemed to make the oppressive underground city become resplendent in an instant. As it slowly fell, the golden gate slowly opened, revealing the real treasure inside. Chapter 165. The phantom of the Cyclops King smiled, and two six-sided dice appeared out of thin air in front of him. 1 hourglass, 1 person. This was the result of rolling the dice. The phantom of the Cyclops King was a magic guard made by the dead master of the East Tower for the Wozang royal family. Its function was to communicate with the endless sky vault hidden in the void and determine the time and number of people entering and exiting the vault. The technology of making this kind of magic guard was ancient and advanced. The Senate had tirelessly arranged people to secretly study it for hundreds of years. Although the top Japanese mages could decipher part of the technology, there was no way to make an identical guard. According to the research materials obtained from the Eastern Tower, the best-case scenario for the magic creation test product was that it would collapse on its own after 2 days. They guessed that the reason why this guard could exist so stably was that it was closely connected to the Endless Sky treasure. The Endless Sky scripture was a secret of the former royal family of the Wozang Empire. After the emperor was overthrown, they searched through the royal library and found some useful clues. According to those clues, the Endless Sky Vault was actually related to an existence called the Highest Heaven. Legend had it that the highest heaven was the descendant of the gods in the upper world. Compared with the abominations who were hated by their parents, disliked by their grandparents, and loved by their uncles, the highest heaven grew up in a honeypot. Most of them had beautiful faces, perfect figures, and overwhelming confidence. When the highest heaven was unhappy, the clouds would cry salt water, dead fish would rush to the riverbanks and lakes, and leaves in the nearby forest would rustle. When the highest heaven was happy, the warm sunlight would follow them to every corner. Small animals would play in their footsteps, and birds would sing loudly, filling the sky. The highest heaven was an immortal titan. Their parents loved them and would not bear to let them suffer any grievances. They would never age, and using advanced restoration spells was as simple as breathing. In battle, the highest heaven was often fearless, partly because of their own strength, and partly because they knew that even if they had 1 foot in the coffin, they would most likely be resurrected by their parents. However, just like how the giant beast Hurrikel could be killed by the wish spell, the highest heaven could also die when they left the upper world. However, killing a supreme celestial would infuriate at least 2 gods, as well as many other supreme celestials who were on good terms with him. The one-eyed king who founded the Wozang was a descendant of the supreme heaven. Although as an ordinary mortal, this kind of heavenly bloodline had been passed down to his generation, and there was not much power left, the one-eyed king still had a talent that ordinary people could not reach. The Endless Sky Vault could also be considered as one of these talents. Thanks to his ancestors, the Cyclops King inherited the dimensional fragment, which was used as one of the many rooms to store gifts from others. In fact, the Cyclops King had only spent an insignificant portion of it to establish his own kingdom. After his death, the treasure was treated as a family heirloom by the Japanese royal family. It was only passed down from one emperor to another. The way to open the Endless Sky treasury required a special secret imprint. The eyes of the Supreme Heaven bloodline had a secret imprint in the shape of a magatama. Every time the door to the Endless Sky treasury was summoned, the Wusong Emperor had to use this eye to identify himself. For the real Supreme Celestials, this was not a burden at all. However, for their mortal descendants, this method of identification had a lot of hidden dangers. The Cyclops King had 3 magatama in his eyes. However, because he frequently opened the Endless Sky Vault to obtain treasures during the founding of the Wusong Empire, his right eye was completely blind. As the bloodline of the descendants of the Cyclops King continued to thin, even the emperors with the highest concentration of bloodline gradually lost the number of magatama in their eyes. In the end, the Wusong emperors who only had 1 magatama in their eyes could only open the door to the ancestral treasure twice in their lives. After that, their eyes would lose their light. In desperation, the last emperor of the Wusong Empire could only use some kind of collection in the Endless Sky Vault in exchange for the help of the owner of the East Tower. With the help of the magic created by the owner, the emperor of the Wusong Empire could open the treasure again at a lower cost. There is only one chance to open the door to the endless sky vault every 10 years. At the same time, the time and number of people to enter the treasure had to be determined by the result of the six-sided dice. However, the last emperor did not open the door many times. Hundreds of years ago, because of the irreconcilable sharp contradiction between the rising business aristocracy and the royal family, the reform action broke out overnight. Led by the general, the economic advisor of the royal family at that time, and now the Senate, the emperor was pulled down from the throne. In order to completely eliminate the hidden danger, they had originally decided to eliminate the source of the problem and completely cut off the inheritance of the Cyclops King. However, during the execution of the plan, there was a shocking change. Although cutting off the bloodline of the Japanese royal family would not cause a war between the gods like killing a real supreme heavenly, the mastermind behind the plot would definitely be cursed. When the bull hanged the emperor's concubines and children one by one with the bowstring, the curse took effect before the death of the last emperor. Originally, even the bull, who was supposed to be the executioner, thought that the curse would fall on him. However, in order to realize the general's plan, he still volunteered to be the dirty glove. However, who would have thought that the final curse would directly find the mastermind of the reform? The majestic legendary warrior, who was as strong as a god, and later became the general of the Wusong Empire, had become a dying old man in the blink of an eye. Even if the wizards later saved his life by absorbing the vitality of the slaves, his dwarf appearance could not be changed. Therefore, he had been hiding his body in the mithril armor and showing up as a silver warrior. After repeated deductions by the spellcasters, if they insisted on cutting off the Wozang royal family, which had the bloodline of the supreme heavens, an even more terrifying curse might appear on all those who participated in the reform conspiracy. The rising business aristocracy, the general, and the Speaker of the Senate could not be spared. Therefore, the last emperor of the Wusong Empire was left behind. However, the participants of the reform came up with an even more vicious plan. They were prepared to pollute the bloodline of the supreme heavens in order to achieve the goal of gradually cutting off this inheritance. First, they would use magic to induce the emperor to have sex with a female ugly giant. Then, they would lock the offspring in the underground of Cloud City and let them live and die on their own. This was the origin of the ugly giants in the Cloud City ruins. Thinking of the plan he had participated in hundreds of years ago, even the cold-hearted speaker felt a chill run down his spine. From then on, he firmly believed that the human heart was the most sinister thing in the world. The human heart was sinister, and the world was unpredictable. The Wusong Empire, which had changed from an imperial system to a republic system of the Senate, began to slowly develop in the Ashes world. It staggered along the way, and later almost controlled most of the world's slave trade. During this period, the Wusong Empire had experienced several tests. There was a time when they were faced with a life and death situation where the demon Duke Batsu coveted their lives, and the chairman and the general both thought of the former royal treasure. That was the first time the two of them had entered the Cloud City ruins buried deep beneath the Cloud City. They had found the king of the ruined giants at that time. The ruined giants had the shortest natural lifespan among the giants. They weren't even much longer than ordinary people. They used the guy with the thin bloodline of the one-eyed king to open the endless sky treasure. Maybe because the bloodline was too thin, the two of them could only gouge out the guy's eyeballs and let the master of the East Tower identify them. But even so, they could only roll 2 ones, one for a person and one for an hourglass. Originally, the speaker suggested to use the space equipment so that they could take out more treasures at one time, and they could go back and forth several times in an hourglass. But after entering, the moment he opened the space equipment, the endless sky treasure closed. It was only after the general gouged out the other eye of the ugly giant king that the door of the treasury was opened again. As a last resort, they could only rely on the general to carry the treasures on his shoulders and desperately go back and forth in an hourglass to take out enough treasures. When the endless sky treasure was completely closed, The virtual body of the one-eyed king reminded them. The bloodline of the supreme heavens has become too filthy, and it can only be opened once every 100 years. Just like that, 100 years later, the two of them entered the hidden heavens of the endless sky again. When the two eyeballs were an hourglass, they unexpectedly failed again because they asked the mage to use Tonson's floating disc or something similar to make it easier to transport. The mage who knew the secret was personally dealt with by the general. Now, it was time to open the treasury again, and Japan happened to be in an economic crisis. Although the general didn't come back, the speaker didn't have time to wait for him, so he asked the accompanying mage and guards to escort him to withdraw the money. Before opening the door, he had already thought about it. In a situation where he could only rely on manpower to transport the treasures, he had to choose some magic items or gems of higher value and transport them out in a bag. Although these things couldn't be exchanged for goods and currency in Japan, they could still be used to solve the urgent needs by trading with other planes. But just as the speaker was about to take action, there were 3 muffled sounds behind him, 2 light and 1 heavy. He turned his head and saw the captain of the guards and the accompanying mage that he had brought along, as well as the ugly giant that was held up by Tan Sen's floating saucer, fall to the ground. A strange man wearing a purple robe and a golden mask was walking towards him. The Grand Vader. The speaker's eyes widened to the maximum. He recognized the identity of the newcomer from his outfit. This was not surprising. Before planning the invasion of Medic, Japan had sent a large number of elite ninjas to infiltrate. Because he wanted to enter the endless sky treasure, he had already taken off a large number of magic items that he had brought with him. The speaker groped around, and only a jade knife that he had just used to gouge out the eye could be counted as a weapon. At this time, he also understood where the fire in Chuyun City came from. Chapter 166. The Japanese were experts at backstabbing. Just as the Speaker of the Senate was about to fall into despair, a lightning-like blade light cut through the darkness of the underground city, and the sharp tip of the blade pierced through the body of the Grand Vader without any delay. Iato stab, saber draw, cassock dance. With a rapid change of moves, the attacker's long saber turned into a sky full of saber shadows within a breath. Lower left, upper right, upper left, lower right. Wherever the blade went, the clothes were torn and the flesh was separated. This was the dragonfly slash. The speaker recognized the long saber and the person who used it. Although all the nobles of the Senate did not think that the general would die in Medica's hands, how could he suddenly appear here? No, the other party did not have the time to answer the speaker's doubts. The general, wearing a giant enchanted mithril armor, was showing the true strength of a legendary warrior without any distractions. With the power increase of the enchanted armor, his wielding of the saber was faster and more powerful, and the already sharp dragonfly slash instantly turned into a meat grinder. Even if the opponent was a steel golem, there was no way it could escape at this time. With the sound of the saber being sheathed, the broken limbs, which were smaller than the size of an ordinary person's palm, began to fall to the ground. The golden mask, which had been sent flying at the beginning, fell in front of the speaker's feet, covered with cut marks. Something's wrong. A cold voice came from the silver warrior's armor, and with his own belated evaluation, the body that had been cut into pieces instantly turned into flying ash. Keek keek. A chilling sound rang out from the darkness, and a dark red light accurately hit the silver warrior. The speaker of the Council of Elders, who had just risen from the joy of surviving the disaster, immediately fell to the bottom. However, as a purely civilian, the speaker of the Council of Elders could do nothing about it. But he did not despair. The general's enchanted mithril armor seemed to work, and a magic sneak attack only made the legendary warrior's figure shake a little. Seeing that his heavy injury spell did not work, the annoying sneer of the attacker seemed to pause awkwardly. But he immediately reacted and tried to use Web, a spell commonly used against warriors, to restrain the opponent first. This was the specialty of the mage class. In actual combat, they had to rationally deal with all kinds of sudden problems. Although 5 fireballs in a row was theoretically more powerful than Meteor Storm. It was rare for mages to only use Fireball in a real battle. However, the strategy of using Web to restrict the Silver Warrior did not work. The legendary warrior obviously had a lot of experience in dealing with mages. When a spellcaster chanted 2 or 3 syllables of the spell, the legendary warrior used a zigzag charge to interfere with the opponent's aim. Katana, against the wind. The dragonfly's slash swung from the bottom to the top, and the blade emitted a sharp whistling sound as it pressured the air. Because the speed of the blade was too fast, the spellcaster hiding in the darkness had no time to move and dodge. He could only lie on the ground and roll to avoid the attack. Tangzhan, ground nailing. The Silver Warrior took advantage of the situation to pursue and attack, not giving the opponent any chance to breathe. The general held the dragonfly cutter in a reverse grip and ruthlessly nailed it to the spellcaster's rolling body on the ground. With a rip, the purple robe was torn apart by the long blade, and some of the threads on the robe instantly turned into yellow fluorescent dust. Realizing that this might be a medium for some kind of spell, the general hurriedly wanted to withdraw his sword and retreat, but the spellcaster lying on the ground quickly grabbed his mithril boots and the blade of the dragonfly cutter. Magnetization. With a short incantation, under the effect of the spell, part of the properties of the items touched by the mage changed and became a strong magnetic metal. The dragonfly cutter ruthlessly cut off a corner of the mithril boots. Scorching metal. The mage was also unforgiving. While the general pulled out his sword, he cast another spell, and the only function of this spell was to heat up the metal to a very high temperature in an instant. The enchanted mithril armor activated its own protective mechanism, and light blue ripples flashed on its surface, gently resisting the high temperature caused by the spell. It was a pity that the mage did not have bat feces and sulfur powder. Otherwise, this would be the perfect time to cast a fireball spell. Serious injury. He could only rationally allocate resources and energy again, and use the most convenient talent to deal the greatest damage to the Silver Warrior. In order to increase the penetration effect of this spell, the mage took the risk of using contact casting. He clenched his fist tightly and punched the chest of the mithril armor. With the strength of a mage, this punch to the chest was not small. The legendary warrior wearing the enchanted mithril armor even had to take half a step back before he could stand firm. However, when a mage engaged in close combat, compared to bringing unexpected surprises to the warriors, it was more of an unexpected gain. The mithril gauntlet clenched its fist tightly, and the Silver Warrior's wrist twisted, and the dragonfly cutter that eliminated the magnetic force easily cut off the mage's arm. Ear-piercing laughter strangely came from the mage's mouth, as if the arm that was cut off by the general was not his own. The arm that was cut off suddenly turned into a dry corpse, then rapidly expanded and violently exploded in the general's hand. Rotting corpse explosion. The sudden explosion was so violent that the Silver Warrior was blown away by the blast, and his gauntlet was also deformed. What was more critical was that if the general was injured in the rotting corpse explosion just now, he was likely to be infected with a disease of the undead. In a battle with a spellcaster, the whole process was a battle of wits and courage. If one was not careful, the rhythm would be disrupted. In the spirit of taking advantage of the situation, the mage who succeeded in his attack turned into a whistling sandstorm on the spot and quickly rushed to the Silver Warrior. The enchanted mithril armor was still a little too restrained for a spellcaster. He wanted to get in through the gaps of the armor to torture and hurt the opponent. No! A shrill roar came out from the enchanted mithril armor, but the owner of the voice was the mage himself. He was like an ordinary person who was grabbed by the ankle by the devil and was slowly being dragged into the hell of Bator. His voice was getting softer and softer. In the process, the general's mithril armor seemed to have let out a burp. A huge hole suddenly appeared in the abdomen of the armor. A large amount of life force was absorbed from other people through some kind of corruption magic array to form a substantial vortex of energy. The The spellcaster who tried to invade the mithril armor was now in the center of the energy mass, but his body had become the size of a mouse, and the energy of the corruption magic was still constantly torturing him. The small body was like being cut into pieces, dissipating little by little and slowly being assimilated. If His Excellency the Grand Vader only has this much ability, then he really doesn't live up to his name. The general's voice sounded again, still cold and without a trace of emotion. The humiliating words seemed to be stating a fact. The applause from not far away interrupted the Silver Warrior's evaluation. The Senate speaker, who had been playing a small role, looked in the direction of the sound and saw a figure in a purple robe strolling out of the darkness. The two, just now. The Senate speaker's Adam's apple involuntarily choked, and he wisely stopped talking. Seeing this scene, there was no need to say more. It was obvious that the two Grand Vader were just pawns that were thrown out. So, is this person the Grand Vader or not? The Senate speaker thought to himself. Excuse me. It was just an ordinary sentence, but the suggestion spell worked. The Senate speaker was stunned for a moment. Then he immediately picked up the golden mask at his feet and handed it to the newcomer. Putting on his mask again, the Grand Vader patted the shoulder of the top Japanese dignitary and said, "Thank you." It was not that the general standing at the side did not do anything. It was just that with the appearance of the latest purple-robed man, the Silver Warrior's body was covered by a tough spider web that was summoned out of thin air. Spellcasting, silent spellcasting. The legendary warrior immediately realized the horror of the newcomer. He immediately activated all the functions of the enchanted mithril armor while gathering all the strength in his body. A light blue halo lingered on the armor made of precious materials. As if it was getting rid of the high temperature brought by the scorching metal, the enchanted mithril armor began to break free from the magic spiderwebs that wrapped around it. I'm a little late. There's some work that needs to be arranged in advance. The Grand Vader explained to the legendary warrior who was secretly gathering power in front of him in a voice that was like a cool breeze. So I could only send 2 useless subordinates to delay the 2 of you, but it seems that I didn't buy much time. It seems that those useless guys who are alive are the same after death. The Grand Vader had just sent 2 mummies that he had executed and made, and the second of them was the Black-Robe Garrison Mage Captain who was in cahoots with the Man-Eater and others in Gnome City. The powerful legendary spellcaster explained a few words, and seeing that the other party had no intention of asking him questions, he shrugged and said no more. The Silver Warrior had completely freed himself from the web spell, but the current rhythm was completely controlled by the Grand Vader, and he really did not dare to draw his sword easily. After waiting for a little while, a rustling sound came, and then a huge collapse appeared on the ground, and a deep pit appeared at the entrance of the Endless Sky Vault. The commander of the Pickaxe troops, the patriarch of the Fire Dwarf clan, climbed out of the pit. The Fire Dwarf patriarch was just about to say something when the Grand Vader threw over a round object, the left eye of the King of Giants. The legendary mage said first, "We have to hurry. There's only about 1.5 hourglasses left." The Grand Vader was coveting the treasure that the highest heaven had left for the future generations. The general standing on the side understood in his heart. He pulled out the dragonfly cutter and rushed to the target. With a flash of the blade, the head of the Senate, who was controlled by the suggestion spell, was instantly separated from his body. But this was not a deliberate murder. Top Japanese nobles like them had many ways to save their lives, and the secondary stasis cloning spell was an indispensable measure. The killed head of the Senate would immediately be resurrected in his clone, so that the suggestion spell could be lifted from him. For the general, this way of saving his life might lose a large part of his strength. But for the head of the Senate, this method had no side effects other than a headache for a while. Besides, the Silver Warrior still had some things he wanted to say to the Grand Vader alone. Chapter 167. With the clanking of hammers, the Fire Dwarves set up various equipment step by step. With the help of scaffolding and cranes, the engineers of the Pickaxe unit were busy hauling crates out of the dug holes and carefully stacking them. These crates were filled with pottery of various sizes. Some were empty, but most of them were filled with liquid. A dozen fire dwarves opened the two largest crates, which contained two clay vats about 3 feet in diameter and 5 feet in height. They loaded the two clay vats onto a huge cart that was pieced together with spare parts, and then opened the other crates. These crates were stuffed with clay vats filled with solution. To prevent bumping, the containers were also filled with hay. These smaller clay vats were divided into two categories, red and black. The ratio of the vats to the vats was about 3-to-1. Some fire dwarves wearing leather aprons and leather gloves came over and carefully poured the solution into the clay vats on the cart. After mixing, the solution immediately released heat, and some steam rose from the clay vats. The chief of the fire dwarves personally checked the vats. When he saw that the color of the mixed solution had turned yellow, he immediately raised his hand to the great weasel. The process was complicated, but it did not take too much time because the engineers of the pickaxe troop operated it in an orderly manner. When the chief of the fire dwarves pushed the two steaming clay vats, together with some nozzles and conduits, into the gate of the vault of the endless sky, the blood gushing out from the neck of the Speaker of the Senate had not yet had time to coagulate into a blood scab. Sharpening the knife will not delay the work of cutting wood. This is an old Eastern proverb. The great weasel instructed the fire dwarves while speaking to the silver warrior without looking back. The general is still here. I think you must have something to say. The other party pondered for a moment and decided to tell the truth. As wise as you are, I do have a proposal. I wonder if... Just say it. The mouth of a fire dwarf is as solid and reliable as the body of bronze. I am ready to form an alliance with the United States on behalf of the Japanese, but first, I need a polished war report. Disputes that can't be settled on the battlefield can't be settled on the negotiation table. What I mean is that you Japanese are invaders and losers at the same time. There is no problem in forming an alliance, but please remember that the weak have the right to choose. The silver warrior held the dragonfly cutter and tried his best to control his emotions. He calculated for a moment. If he were to take the enemy by surprise, what would be the probability of success if he swung his saber? But after his rationality came to the conclusion that it was impossible, he still let go of the saber hilt that had his fingerprints imprinted on it. Since that's the case, let's change the premise. The magicians have already analyzed the loot from the Eastern Spirit Binding Tower. We would like to use this information in exchange for assistance. Hearing the general's explanation, the great weasel understood why the Japanese were so insistent on starting a war. At the same time, he really didn't know what words to use to describe the business aristocrats who were in charge of the empire. Idealist, radical, speculator, perhaps it was a combination of both. They were so conceited that they dared to make a deal with the devil. It turned out that in the largest commercial center in the Ashes world, the Zhejiang talent market, the 9 prisons of Bader secretly supported the slave trade, which even involved a VM agreement. Of course, for the slave trade, the introduction of Bader Venture was indeed beneficial. With the Batsu people's connections throughout the multiverse, the slave trade of the Japanese Empire could reach more foreign lands. This would undoubtedly help them achieve their great ambition of becoming the slave masters of all worlds. But there were two sides to everything. Compared with making a deal with the devil, asking a tiger for its skin could be said to be a piece of cake. In order to let the Zhejiang talent market gain the support of the devils, in addition to authorizing the devil merchants to operate a very strange rabbit skin business in Japan, the Japanese Senate had also agreed to other agreements such as performance VM, stock exchange, and debt conversion. In Medici, there had once been a merchant who had done something similar. In order to expand the scale of his business, he had found some rich tribesmen to be shareholders. As a result, not long after, the door of his shop was blocked by barbarians who claimed that it was his business. But now, the Japanese were not facing small troubles like barbarians at the door. What they were facing was big demons at the door. The plan of the aristocrats of the Senate to sell goods to all worlds was so huge that even the slightest carelessness could cause the ship to capsize. In fact, these risks had already fallen into the hands of the devils. According to the contract drawn up with the devil investors in the lower world, the business in Zijiangin must increase by more than 20% every year. The Wozang Empire had been working hard for 130 years to achieve this growth. The successive losses in the war against Medici have affected this business, so I hope. The general's words were interrupted by the listener. The Grand Vader, who had been speaking Japanese in a gentle and fluent manner, changed his tone and said in a stiff tone, "Hope is sometimes just an excessive denial of reality. If the so-called assistance is to help the Japanese Senate repudiate such a large debt to the devils, then I'm sorry, This time, it was the Grand Vader's turn to be interrupted. No, we don't want to repudiate the debt. What we need is some of the methods of making chimeras from the northern Tasharexol binding sorcerers. Please don't deny it yet. The Japanese elite ninja's ability to obtain information is not inferior to the meta-sized sniffer. You may already know that our airships carry dart bats and other chimeras on board. This is the technology obtained from the Soul Binding Tower in the East. However, the achievements of the East Tower and the North Tower in the field of chimeras are really not the same. Our intelligence network has obtained the two riots that broke out in Medici, the Blazing Shadow Beast and the Shark Lizard Beast. We need these products with excellent appearance. If we can sell these biological weapons to the other side, the crisis of Japan will be solved. And according to the information we have analyzed from the East Tower, chimeras are not the ultimate goal of the soul binding sorcerers. Creating such highly intelligent monsters is just part of their research process. The collapse of the negotiations was saved by the general's words. Although the Grand Vader didn't even need to use lie detection to know that this guy was hiding something. But as he said, the manufacturing technology of chimeras was not core technology. For the soul binding sorcerers, this kind of technology was in the category of trade. So the conversation entered a friendly, business mutual praise stage. Until a gurgling stream of water rushed out of the gate of the endless sky. The color of this stream was blood red and flowed into the ditch made by the fire dwarfs with cylindrical pottery pipes cut open. Along the ditch, the stream poured into the big pit formed by the collapse of the ground. The fire dwarf patriarch ran out with the pottery cart and pushed another filled pottery cart that had been prepared for him by his clansmen. He flew back to the endless sky again. Under the unremitting efforts of the pickaxe troops, the stream of water formed by the alchemy solution kept pouring out of the endless sky. In the big pit dug by the fire dwarfs, ceramic pipes were laid. The alchemy solution flowed along these pipes to the newly built sewage treatment tank outside the city. Commander Wenfeng, who was guarding next to the sewage treatment tank, scooped out half a cup of blood-red sewage with a glass cup. Then, like magic, he took out another glass tube and mixed the alchemy solution inside it into the glass cup. He looked at the golden powder that had settled at the bottom of the glass cup in his hand, and then looked at the blood-red water that kept gushing out of the water inlet not far away. He thought of the blessing that the staff in the notary office and the registration office had given him before. Business is booming, and money is coming in every day. In front of the gate of the endless sky, the general looked at the alchemy solution that kept flowing out and couldn't help but ask, "What is this?" "This is the down payment I received before making a deal with the Neon Empire," the Great Weasel replied. He had decided to make a deal with the Neon Empire regarding chimeras. He was indeed very curious about the research of the master of the East Tower. In the house of the counselor that he had controlled with his powerful command, the Great Weasel had seen with his own eyes the novel technique of extracting life genetic material from fossils of ancient creatures. The magic creation in front of him that was connected to the space of the endless sky once again proved that the master of the East Tower must be extraordinary to be able to become a mage in charge of the Square Tower. The Great Weasel speculated that, compared to Shurek, who liked to freely create new chimeras, the dead master of the East Tower might be more inclined to restore ancient creatures. As a soul-binding mage, the master of the East Tower should have hoped to restore part of the complex ecosystem of the Ashes world before the cataclysm and find an opportunity to balance the chaos between the body and the soul. If this was true, then some of the contents of the research might be of great help to the Great Weasel's own plan. He had personally been to the ruins of the East Tower before. After being occupied by the Neon Empire, the place had been thoroughly searched and no clues could be found. For the Great Weasel, this deal was definitely an excellent opportunity to obtain the knowledge of the master of the East Tower. After finalizing all the details, a magic contract was concluded between the two. As the last drop of alchemy's solution gushed out of the endless sky, the fire dwarfs nervously and orderly packed up all kinds of equipment and facilities. In the sewage canal cleanup station, Commander Wenfeng closed the gate of the camp and ordered the general on duty to lead all the people who had heard the news to guard the sewage disposal tank. The Great Weasel and Commander Wenfeng each tore a magic scroll, and the directional transmission spell was instantly launched. In order to prevent any accidents, Commander Wenfeng took out hundreds of the largest amount of obsidian magic beads to power the scroll. As the transmission spell took effect, the two groups of people turned into a breeze and left the Neon Land. Chapter 168. For the Megalosaurus, sleeping on a mountain of treasures was their daily routine. But for the Pasha, their daily routine was to review a mountain of financial reports. It had been more than half a month since the Japanese Senate formally surrendered to Pharaoh. During this time, many things had happened that made Keys happy. For example, the ogre blacksmith Neru had recovered, his magic research had entered a new field, and he had successfully replicated the nut-flavored ice cream better than Blue the Gourmet, and so on. But during this time, there were also some things that made the young blue dragon feel a little vexed. For example, financial reports, and financial reports, the financial population introduction plan of Gnome City, the flood reconstruction plan of Sparut City, the trade subsidy application plan of the Desert Tribes, and the tax reduction application plan submitted by some large merchant guilds and chambers of commerce. The core of these financial reports was nothing more than one word: money. They really don't want to live anymore. Keys's almond yellow eyes seemed to flash with lightning. He looked at the desert kobold servant beside him and asked in a cold tone, "Have they forgotten the true identity of Keys Feeden? Apart from being a pasha, I am also a blue dragon. What do you think?" Beside the Megalosaurus in human form, the servant of the Dragonborn clan was so scared that he almost crawled on the ground. When he heard Keys emphasize that he was a blue dragon, he swallowed nervously. Those who had seen his true form would not really treat him as a blue dragon. But the desert kobold was not a fool. There was no need to risk offending a powerful true dragon just to point out the falsehood in his words. He tried to clamp his tail and carefully answered his master's question. "You don't have to pay attention to the nonsense of those fellows. Letting the great lord of the dragon Ness be their leader without asking for tribute is letting them off easy. If you ask me, we should take advantage of the situation in the city to make a fortune." Looking at the Megalosaurus in human form, the desert kobold servant struck while the iron was hot. "Now that your name has spread far and wide in the desert, all the tribes are fighting to join you. Many sand lizard men have come to our town to make a living. The elders have put them into the patrol team. The people in the city are not doing well, so the weapons and armor must be very cheap. If you buy from them personally, you might even get a special discount." "Who told you this?" Keys interrupted the servant. "The elder of our town's historian. He said that if there is a chance, he would like to remind you that according to the ancient tradition, the 11th day of the 10th month of the year is the best day to buy." The desert kobold thought for a moment and repeated the words that the elder had told him with great seriousness. "What is your name?" "My name is Zhou Zhuijinzu." A magic ray flew out from Keys' palm. Under the effect of the malice transformation spell, the desert kobold servant that was hit immediately turned into a shivering sheep. "Change your name, or add a roasted whole lamb for dinner tonight." The kobold servant with the name Little Troublemaker, that was still fresh in Keys' memory from his previous life, was spared. It was not because the evil dragon suddenly changed its personality, but because the young blue dragon was afraid that he would be contaminated by something bad if he ate it. However, Jojua's words did remind the young blue dragon that doing business which combined buying and selling, would often bring more benefits than just taxes and tributes. The profits would be higher, and the profits would last longer. Keyes was not optimistic about the usual business model of the Blue Dragon race. Plundering, taxation, and extortion would not last long, and collecting protection fees would be too high compared to the output. Previously, the old Dragon Sirota had created the tribute model. Merchants with Dragon Nest badges would offer goods in exchange for the scales and teeth that the Blue Dragon clan members in the Dragon Nest fought or fell off naturally. It was indeed a kind of innovation. However, this was not enough. Moreover, the income in this area was the Dragon Nest's income. Keyes had no reason to use it for the city's citizens and tribesmen. On this point, even if the author changed his origin to that of a metal dragon, there was no room for discussion. The only choice was to integrate the resources brought by the title of Pasha and invest these resources into business operations to generate enough income. A part of the profits could be used to supplement the financial needs of various regions due to the reduction of taxes after the war. Although he didn't have any experience in doing business in his previous life, Quest had always thought about the steps of business operations, whether it was running a team game or strategic management games. Therefore, he was not particularly unfamiliar with how to start. But the question was, how should he start the business operations? Should he use the farming talent inherited in the genes of his family to upgrade the industry and climb the technology tree in the Ash world? Or should he use the geographical advantage to vigorously promote trade operations? Or should he use other methods? Megalosaurus were generally very intelligent. Even the white dragon with the title of Shame of the Megalosaurus had crazy and powerful spellcasters. When they thought about problems, they often started from reality and would not be inflexible. They also knew how to inspect and consult. Unable to think of a way to start, Keyes walked out of the house that he had stayed in for a long time. He wanted to go to the Dragon Nest cities, villages, and other places in the Pasha's territory. First, he wanted to understand the places under his jurisdiction and then figure out a way to start. Flying out of the Dragon Nest, the young blue dragon who was invisible walked in the air with the help of the force field control ability. He looked down at the city alliance formed by the large camps of the Dragonborn clans below his feet. Thanks to Keyes' reputation in the war, the city alliance at the foot of the Dragon Nest became the best choice for the desert tribes to join. The inflow of population even exceeded the speed of the expansion of the town. Many who came to join could only camp outside the town fences under the arrangement of the desert kobolds. The city alliance that was almost connected had formed a prototype of a city. This city did not have the protection of walls like other places in Medici. Looking down from the sky, it was like the new city of the Dragonborn clans had lovingly extended a hand of friendship to the desert. Smelling the scent of silver, many brave human merchants began to come to this alien city to look for opportunities. This was thanks to the open-mindedness of Keyes, the Megalosaurus Pasha. In the time of the old Dragon Sirota, except for the merchants who held the badge, it was difficult for other humans to pass through the dangerous desert near the Dragon Nest. The merchants spontaneously organized small bazaars, and they paid taxes in exchange for the right to sell and carry goods here. Patrols composed of desert kobolds, battle lizardmen, and sand lizardmen patrolled here, responsible for the safety of these merchants and dealing with various disputes. And as Zhou Jinzu said, the nearby cities of Nome and Spat were affected by the war. The overstocked goods that the merchants brought to the city alliance of the Dragonborn clans were sold at extremely cheap prices. It could even be said that they were breaking even and clearing the warehouse. Turning back into human form and shuttling through the bustling crowd of bazaars, Keyes carefully looked at every kind of goods, and from time to time, he would ask the stall owner about the price. When the stall owner saw that it was a human customer, he was also very enthusiastic to explain to him. "You're new here to see the market, right? Which chamber of commerce are you from?" The stall owner greeted Keyes enthusiastically. "I'm doing a small business myself. I'm worried about the situation here, so I didn't dare to bring any goods to see first." Keyes looked at the desert kobold patrol that had just passed by not far away and pretended to be a little worried. "Don't worry, brother. As long as you pay the business tax on time every day, no one will dare to cause trouble for an ordinary stall with a silver calf per day. Previously, there were roaming bandits who sneaked in to rob, and they were directly hacked to death by the patrols. The stall owner comforted him. After continuing to chat with the stall owner for a while, Keys turned and left. He spent about an hourglass time wandering around the bazaar and found some problems. The merchants did not feel that paying at least one silver calf per day was a burden. But in Medici, this business tax could be considered expensive. This meant that they earned more here, so they could afford it. After careful observation, most of the buyers here were members of the Dragonborn clan. The desert kobolds did not have that many silver calf to pay, so they could only barter with animal hides or other local specialties. The best-selling goods were some metal products such as iron pots and forks. Some of these items would be used after being bought back, but most of them were sent to the newly moved blacksmith shop to be smelted and changed into weapons, armor, and other equipment. This blacksmith shop was opened by a blacksmith rescued by the desert elf Brock from Gnome City. The owner of the shop was called Old Habu by others. This was to distinguish him from his children and grandchildren, Habu and Little Habu. The silver calf collected from the business tax came in handy at this time. The warriors of the Desert Kobold Patrol would receive 1 or 2 silver calf per week in the form of a salary, and these coins were used by them or their families to pay the cost of refining the ironware. Not only that, the young blue dragon also noticed that the clan elders, who had more power over the business tax, would send a large number of silver calf to directly buy exquisite weapons and equipment that could only be produced in the big city of Medici. These were not products that a blacksmith shop that had just set up a furnace could produce. Keys, who had turned invisible, walked past the customers crowded at the entrance of the blacksmith shop and walked into the warehouse where the blacksmith shop stored the goods. On the shelves of the warehouse, the standard weapons of Medici were neatly packed in gunny sacks. Looking at the Sand Rhino Caravan logo drawn in charcoal on the gunny sacks, the young blue dragon's mouth showed a cruel smile. If it were other Megalosaurus, seeing that their kin dared to collect the business tax for their own consumption instead of contributing to their master, they would most likely use their claws and dragon breath to teach them their duty as Megalosaurus slaves in a fit of rage. However, Keys was not such an ordinary Megalosaurus. He did not care about the few silver calf, although he did not have much on him. Compared to the limited silver calf, he cared more about the business model behind the money. After all, the cake of an old acquaintance always looked so delicious. Chapter 169. When the borrowed trouble is finally returned, there will be a sad interest. Santos Ben Jozer's message to his descendants, the founder of the Sand Rhino conglomerate and an early member of the Scales of Eternal Order Chamber of Commerce. When they reached the end of the difficult road, the newly formed Sand Rhino caravan entered the town of the Strongfoot clan. After paying the business tax, the fat merchant led the team to the blacksmith's house to rest. Unlike the other members of the caravan who went to their dormitories to catch up on sleep after unloading the goods, Santos, the boss of the caravan, carried a toolbox as soon as he got off the camel beast. He immediately began to give his little babies a pedicure. After gently patting the ankles of the Sand Rhino a few times, these human-like creatures curled up their hooves. He carefully used tweezers to remove the gravel embedded in the giant camel's toes, then used a scraper to scrape out the broken skin near the wound and applied a brown ointment. He had only recently picked up this craft. Ever since the Sand Rhino caravan became the largest commercial transport team in Gnome City, Santos had not touched the tools used to care for large camel beasts for a long time. But a series of misfortunes had ruined half of his career, causing the fat merchant to have to start from scratch. Let's change them into my iron palms. Santos's current main business partner, Old Hassan, who ran a blacksmith shop in the territory of the Dragonborn clan, walked over. The blacksmith handed the fat merchant a water bag filled with light beer and said, "Your little babies will get used to it in a few days, and you won't have to personally give them a pedicure every time." Santos wanted to argue, but when he thought of the blacksmith's stubborn head, he finally chose to give up. He could not tell his partner that all the money in his pocket had been exchanged for bundles of weapons and equipment. At the very least, He had to wait until they had been exchanged for silver catars that could play beautiful music. Only then would the fat merchant consider buying something new. After finishing the work at hand, Santos took a big gulp of beer to soothe his tired muscles and bones. He then returned the water bag to its owner. "Old man, I promise I'll listen to your advice next time. You can measure the size of these little guys' hooves in advance. But I still have to ask, how's the sales of the previous batch of goods? Why don't we take stock of the inventory and check the accounts first? It's not that I don't trust you, but..." The fat merchant wiped the sweat on his neck with the sleeves of his linen shirt. He carefully avoided using some business-specific terms and tried to use a friendly and encouraging tone with his partner as much as possible. Old Hassan originally hated the philistinism of businessmen. In his opinion, those business words related to silver were a complete blasphemy against the trust that should exist between people. In the past, he had even quarreled with Santos because of this. Every time, he had used the means of accurate accounts and extra accommodation for the members of the business team to strike a heavy blow to the fat merchant who was full of silver coins. But at this moment, the stubborn blacksmith seemed to be a little embarrassed. He poured all the beans he had prepared for his partner's little baby into the trough. He lowered his head and stirred as he said in an apologetic tone, "Fatty, now might not be the right time. Someone told me to tell you to look for him as soon as you arrive." Hearing old Hassan's words, Santos immediately realized that there might be trouble. He just wanted to ask a few more questions, but he found that he couldn't speak at all. Not far away, a young man was looking at him with a smile. When the absent-minded fat merchant followed the young man into a room in the blacksmith shop, many desert kobold warriors immediately ran in and surrounded the room. "Fatty, I nailed your sand rhinoceros with iron paws for free." Old Hassan looked at Santos's back and shouted. Although Sir Pasha had assured him that he had no intention of hurting his partner, the blacksmith knew that Sir Pasha was also the master of the dragon's nest. He was a vicious dragon known for his ferocity. But in the end, Old Hassan found that the Megalosaurus Pasha kept his word. Just as the blacksmith nailed the iron paws on the four hooves of a sand rhinoceros, his partner was released intact. If Santos's unusually excited mental state was not taken into account, the fat merchant was no different from before. How could Santos not be excited? He was overjoyed. Since encountering the coercion of the man-eater in Gnome City, the coercion of the perverted tabby cat in Coptic City, the frightening night of the shark-lizard riot in the Sawan tribe, and the escape of the gnome massacre of the Japanese, this honest merchant felt that his luck was turning for the better for the first time. The terrible Megalosaurus who had once signed a contract with him, the Megalosaurus Pasha who was now in charge of a region, had condescended to negotiate with him, a commoner. The other party had taken a fancy to his operating ability and was willing to invest in the sand rhinoceros caravan to expand the transportation capacity of the caravan. Just before he left the room, Sir Pasha had signed a spell contract with him. The contract stipulated, Megalosaurus will invest 300,000 silver cats in Santos in his personal name. The entire investment is divided into 3 phases. The first phase of 100,000 silver cats will be paid in one lump sum before leaving the Dragon Clan town. The subsequent investment will be settled according to the phases under the guarantee of the taxes of the Pasha's territory for the next few years. After the caravan achieves a profit, Megalosaurus will distribute dividends from the profits. The dividend ratio is 50%. Megalosaurus Pasha will have the ownership of the Sand Rhinoceros Chamber of Commerce, but the management will always be held by Santos and his family. The phases of implementation proposed by Megalosaurus were nothing more than the transportation capacity of the caravan reaching 500 sand rhinoceros and 1,000 sand rhinoceros respectively. These requirements may be difficult for others, but for a veteran merchant like him who had been immersed in the desert transportation industry for many years, it was only a matter of time before it was realized. In terms of the purchase channels of sand rhinoceros, Santos checked. Medicus had 15 farms that could provide at least 700 to 800 sand rhinoceros. Adding in the scattered transactions from various cities, it It was no problem to gather 1,000 sand rhinoceros in a year. In addition, there would definitely be a discounted price for purchasing from the farms. Just from this alone, more than 300,000 silver cats was enough for him to make a big profit. Fortunately, Megalosaurus did not understand the market. The fat merchant thought happily. However, out of fear of the Pasha, Santos was not ready to put all the money in his pocket. He considered spending more money on recruiting people. He had to find a group of smart and capable subordinates. This way, he could not only act as a front, but also ensure the safety of such a large-scale caravan. It could also make the Pasha feel that it was worth the money when he reviewed it. Although Megalosaurus had a high percentage of the profits and had become the owner of the sand rhinoceros caravan, the tax exemption was very high. According to the regulations of Medicus, the business operated by the Pasha's family had the right to tax exemption. In the future, the transportation capacity of 1,000 sand rhinoceros was 10 times the previous peak of Santos' operation. After securing the management rights, the amount of money he could earn would be at least 5 times more than the best years of the previous years. Coupled with the protection of the magic contract, anyone would think that this was a great opportunity. However, the fat merchant did not see that in the corner of the contract, there was a sentence that said, "The right of final interpretation belongs to party," and command spell was not the most brilliant enchantment spell. "Old man, I just heard you say that you will give me the sand rhinoceros iron palm for free, right?" Key's investment in the sand rhinoceros caravan was not a whim. It was a very important part of his entire business plan. Long before Santos drove the camel beast to the town of the Dragonborn clan, the young blue dragon had completed the inspection of the territory under his jurisdiction. Chapter 170. The Megalosaurus is a creature that does not know how to socialize. Unless it is with its companions, it always likes to communicate with other people or creatures in a confident and arrogant tone. However, due to the strength of the Megalosaurus, there are always other creatures who serve it out of fear or ingratiation. They are even willing to be the pawns of the Megalosaurus. If a Megalosaurus does not have a few decent pawns around it, there's only one possibility: he or she is not strong enough. The Life of the Megalosaurus by Brew, a famous dragon researcher. Our protagonist is very strong, so there are people who are willing to serve him at his beck and call. As they walked into Spat, someone who had received the message came to greet them. The leader of the underground guild, who had escaped from Gnome City with the blacksmith, Santos of the Sand Rhino Caravan, and Brock the Desert Elf, was now standing respectfully in front of Keys. His real name was unknown. Most of his subordinates and people called him boss, sir, and other respectful titles. However, in front of the Megalosaurus Keys, the leader of the underground guild humbly called himself Glove. Glove had left his family in the town of the Dragonborn clan. In his opinion, it was the safest place in the huge Medici. Even though he had his own network in the capital, Beitar, he was still more optimistic about Keys, the powerful Megalosaurus Pasha. A strong ruler often meant that the people could live and work in peace. When a young blue dragon found the gauntlet and asked him to investigate Spat City, the former leader of the underground society in Gnome City agreed without hesitation. Do not disobey the strong. This was the lesson Glove had learned from his old opponents who had failed and died in his place. Just like how expanding the caravan and purchasing sand rhinoceroses were familiar to the fat merchant Santos. Sneaking into Spat City was a piece of cake for Glove, who used to be in charge of the underground of the city. His social network was still very useful in this city. Moreover, after the catastrophe, the people here were in a state of panic, and the chaos in the market gave him many opportunities to take advantage of. In less than half a month, all the gangsters in Spat knew that an old senior had come. Glove announced his arrival like a fierce dragon crossing the river. The guys who were responsible for maintaining the simple underground order of the city were either dead or injured, and the rest were recruited by Glove to work for him. The previous gangster leaders could only engage in kidnapping and extortion. At most, they could only collude with the bandits outside the city. Now, They were all wiped out by the Megalosaurus Pasha, filling their wallets and saving money on their subordinates' meals. There was no skill to speak of, as their subordinates, naturally, they could only drink cold soup at most. The method of using gloves was completely different. As an old senior, he had long been used to seeing the world. In the past, the gangsters in Spat could only be considered as street thugs at best, but the gloves showed them the advanced operation concept of the underground guild. Using his connections, Glove found 38 of the largest brewers in Medici. In front of these representatives, he took out the specialty grain of Spat, glutinous wheat. This grain grew on the fertile soil of the Nero River. It was very glutinous and very suitable for brewing. In the past, the brewers had to spend a lot of money to buy this raw material from Governor Agu. Although the city had been burned and flooded, there was still a lot of grain in Spat. Ordinary people certainly did not have any surplus, but the members of the Agu family certainly had some. Moreover, after the Uyuzans occupied the city, they moved all the grain in the official granary of the Medici Empire to the governor's mansion, preparing to rob them all through the portal. However, the war was tense, and these grains were all put aside. Due to the high terrain of the governor's mansion, this batch of grain luckily escaped the flood and was preserved intact. Originally, the new governor was going to use this batch of grain to help the disaster victims in Spat. However, the Agu family claimed that this batch of grain originally belonged to their family and should be handed over to them. Due to the blood relationship with Pharaoh and the pressure from Bite City, the governor had to agree to the request of the Agu family. This batch of grain was in the hands of the Agu family, waiting for the best price to sell. The greedy and muddle-headed nobles did not care about the lives of the citizens. They just kept pushing up the price of this batch of high-quality grain. Not only were there complaints in the city, but even the merchants who came to buy grain were also dissatisfied. Glove knew that this was an opportunity that he had to seize. Under his leadership, a new brewery was built in Spat called the Bubbling Beer Barrel. Of course, this brewery was just a smokescreen, operating a legitimate business on the surface. With this disguise, Glove could send out capable men to divide or bribe the staff of the Agu family who were in charge of the grain in the city. The nobles would not do the work themselves. Most of them were served by stewards, and it was this that helped Glove a lot. Often, a small investment could be exchanged for a large harvest. Glove's men carried grain to the beer barrel by truck, but the clerk only calculated the price according to the fraction of a load. Later, even the guards of the Agu family were recruited. A few bags of moldy grain were thrown on a cart full of high-quality grain, and the whole cart of grain was shipped out at a low price as processed grain. Not only that, the grain that the brewers took away from the beer barrel was also taken care of when they left the city. The experienced Glove naturally did not forget to bribe the guards at the city gate. Therefore, as long as they were his customers, they could enjoy the considerate after-sales service of half price or even free of tax. Of course, there were also some ignorant guys who wanted to snatch the food from Glove's mouth or try to report him. At this time, Glove, who had always shown people the white gloves, would not hesitate to hand over the black gloves. The white gloves gave money and was loved by everyone, while the black gloves demanded lives and was feared by everyone. The rules and regulations of Gnome City's underground guilds were carried over by Glove. Under the leadership of this old senior, the gangsters of Spat City lived a good life that they had never imagined. Not only did their families not have to starve, but they also had spare money to spend from time to time. Glove not only continued to make his old friends praise him for being reliable, he also gained many new friends who wanted to ask him for help. For these new friends, Glove was never stingy with money. He would do his best to help them if they needed anything. When money was scattered, people gathered. Whether it was the neighbors, the officials in the city, or his subordinates, no one did not follow his lead. However, everyone called him different. Some called him generous sir, some called him noble merchant, and most called him daddy boss. But these did not matter. For Glove, the most important thing was to do a good job for the Glove who walked beside him. At this time, the water in the city had receded, but the streets of Spat City were still muddy. Turning from the main road, paved with cobblestones and gravel, into an alley. The road under their feet became more and more difficult to walk. The Demolixnator had cast a levitation spell on everyone here. Otherwise, the huge footprints left by the three ogre brothers would be too conspicuous. Of course, it was hard to ignore these three behemoths walking in the alleyway. "Stop!" A soft shout came from the corner of the alley. A man dressed like a street gangster walked out from behind a pile of wooden barrels. Even under the moonlight, Keyes could see that this man with a beard and a short knife was trembling all over. Anyone who saw so many people in hooded robes in the middle of the night would be afraid, not to mention that there were three of them with such exaggerated figures. However, he still stood out bravely. He wanted to shout for his companions nearby, but when he spoke, his voice became insignificant. Just as he was about to regret his recklessness, a heavenly voice came from the group of monsters opposite him. "Little Tommy, didn't you go to work? Why are you here?" Glove came out, took off his hood, and asked. The street thug heaved a sigh of relief and hurriedly replied, "We've already completed the task that Dad gave us. It's just that the two bastards guarding the city gate still have some martial arts skills. One of my little brothers had his ribs broken. When I came back, I saw—" He pursed his lips and gestured to Quess and the others who were standing behind the gloves. He then kicked one of his men who was hiding behind the wooden barrels. "I was worried that something bad might happen to you, so I wanted to inform everyone." Glove walked to the pile of wooden barrels and saw a man with a beard squatting on the ground and a wounded man lying on a simple stretcher made of 2 spears and a tapestry. He turned back and said to the man with a beard, "Be careful. Be careful next time. Who doesn't have a bunch of people to feed at home? Take your men to the clinic first and let them use the best medicine. I'll send someone to settle the bill later. Come and collect your allowance tomorrow. Tell the accountant to calculate another compensation for the injured. Also, these are my honored guests. Keep your mouths shut and don't talk nonsense." After saying this, Glove nodded apologetically to Keyes, indicating that the matter had been resolved. The young blue dragon was pleasantly surprised by the words of this gangster boss. It reminded him of some movies he had watched in his previous life, so he pressed down on the metal palm of the steampunk half-lich's robe. When the bearded man and one of his men carried the stretcher and passed by Glove, Glove suddenly patted his own head. Then he patted the back of the gangster's head and said, "I almost forgot. Don't forget to dismantle the standard spear of your stretcher. Send the spearheads to the blacksmith. 2 of the door axles of the brewery are broken." Glove walked back to the front of the group and led Keyes and his companions to the end of the alley where the Beer Barrel Brewery was located. Chapter 171. The bubbling beer barrel was at the end of the alley. The houses on both sides of the alley had new roofs. This was one of Glove's new defensive measures. As they walked past, pairs of eyes hidden behind narrow windows stared at them. However, after Glove made a few signals that sounded like the squeaking of rats, the spies carefully avoided their gazes. Before they entered the brewery, Quess and the others could already hear the commotion inside. This was Glove's men drinking in a group. Thanks to their good relationship with Medicus's top brewer, the bubbling beer barrel boilers and brewing ponds were as clean as new, and there was no shortage of real bubbling beer barrels in the warehouse and bar counter. The daddy boss had always been generous. The gangsters could drink 3 glasses of beer for free every day, but they had to pay for the refills. It was not that there was not enough beer, but that Glove did not want his men to become drunkards. However, there were still many hooligans who stayed here all day and didn't return home at night. Many of them used to be street moguls in Spat City. They were not here for nothing. Apart from the cheap drinks and the continuous barbecue, the brewery was also a great place to exchange information and sell illegal goods. With Glove's deterrence, at least no one dared to cheat here. Hey, have you heard? The gang of Broken Teeth is said to be restless recently. They want to make trouble for Pops. And some of them have started to contact the fat pigs of the Igu family. They want to steal from us. Then Broken Teeth will become toothless. Ha! I just want to know how much Pops paid for his rotten teeth. Buddy, you need to learn. Pops called it a reward or a special allowance. But then again, Broken Teeth has a lot of men. He's a tough nut to crack. Are you really that short of money? Well, it's a long story. This thing is too expensive. The leader of the gangsters, who had been chatting with the others in front of the sizzling barbecue, suddenly turned pale. He quickly took out a small piece of something that looked like a soft candy from his pocket and stuffed it into his mouth. After chewing a few times, he quickly swallowed it. Some of the people around him who saw what he was eating frowned and seemed to move a little to the side. Even the few who had always been known to be unscrupulous on the streets were the same. After all, everyone was well aware of the dangers of that thing. As Glove led the way into the bubbling beer barrel, many of the thugs present made an exaggerated noise. They were all greeting their daddy boss, or the boss of bosses, in unison. As soon as they stepped into the brewery, everyone in Keys's team reacted differently. The eyes of the two brothers, Neru and Brew, lit up as they looked at the barbecued meat. The witch doctor, Peru, looked helplessly at the two gluttonous ogre brothers. The sacred warrior, Jinsen, thought of the time when the mercenary army from another plane stopped fighting and rested in the bottomless abyss. The desert elf, Brock, thought of the bonfire feast in the Salem tribe. The young blue dragon and his spell consultant looked at each other and went straight to the leader of the street thugs who had just swallowed something. Under the man's puzzled gaze, Keys picked him up and took out the few remaining moon candies from his pocket. The others who were originally around him all stood up and held their weapons in their hands. However, under Daddy Glove's instructions, the elite fighters who immediately rushed over, as well as the brawny ogres who were carrying exaggerated ebony spikes and staring at them with eager gazes, immediately made the ogres give up. I don't know why this thing would appear here. Glove caught a small piece of moon candies that Keys tossed him. His tone was full of frustration and frustration. It reminded him of his son who was addicted to this thing and was killed by his opponent. This also made his next words sound a little hysterical. I promise myself that anyone who dares to eat it or buy it in my territory will die. That's what I said. Keys, who had the psionic ability, could easily tell that the man was not lying. He raised his hand and threw the man under Glove's feet. Glove did not give the thug any chance to explain. He did not even use the dagger on his waist and directly strangled him to death with both hands. The sudden execution of the family law attracted the attention of all the thugs present. Everyone was silent. A cloaked figure quickly and inconspicuously moved towards the direction of the door. "Where are you going?" "Kitty." "Me." When the young blue dragon's teasing words reached his ears, Rakshasa immediately knew that his stealth had been discovered. He did not even care to tighten his cloak, and immediately jumped up and rushed towards the door. As long as he got out of the door, and then Rakshasa's brain, which had always thought of itself as sharp, crashed into the force field wall with all his might. Seeing stars, he tried to prop himself up from the ground, but the cloak hanging around his neck became like an anchor, pulling him back down to the ground. Seeing what happened to Rakshasa, the thugs in the brewery immediately cleared a large space near the door. Even with their limited knowledge, they knew that something supernatural was happening there, and there must be danger. The real danger was strolling there. Keys used his body to block the door in the direction of Rakshasa's escape and lifted the restriction of the force field spell. The monster, who could move freely again, quickly looked around, trying to find a way to create chaos. But in the end, he helplessly found that he had fallen into the encirclement formed by three strong ogres, a strange metal construct with a lifeless aura, a paladin, and a desert elf's voice warlock. Perhaps his brain was really muddled, and he actually missed Keys. The young blue dragon read Rakshasa's thoughts at this time and smiled. He moved his body and took off the cloak on his body. The cloak stood in the windless air and hung in front of the brewery. His psionic power was activated, producing an effect similar to greater bravery for Rakshasa. With the virtual morale, the middle-sized evil demon was no longer afraid to reveal his body, and he did not care about the screams of the people around him. At this moment, his mind was full of thoughts on how to tear his opponent with his curved claws. After all, he was far stronger than ordinary mortals. Indeed, Rakshasa was not weak in the material plane, and he could even be considered quite powerful. But this was only relative. At this moment, the opponent that this secret agent of a certain existence in the 9 prisons of Bader was facing was far stronger than he imagined. The tiger-headed monster seemed to have forgotten that he was carrying a weapon at his waist. He jumped up like a real big cat and waved his claws to attack his opponent. His high figure made his claws even more fierce. The sharp claws were hidden insidiously between his fingers. If his opponent was not careful, his eyes would be pierced and his head would be smashed. Just as the brawny ogre was about to swing his ebony spikes to help the battle, the steampunk half-lich standing beside him stretched out his metal palm and stopped Nalu's action. Let him play for a while. The considerate words of the spell consultant were somewhat familiar to Keys. It was as if a certain wizard had said something similar, and that he referred to had a strange purple skin. The young blue dragon, who had transformed into a human form, showed a smile similar to that of the he. In an instant, it was as if he was possessed by the purple potato spirit. The powerful fist passed through the opponent's claws at a tricky angle and hit him hard on the tiger's nose. Rakshasa, who could not dodge in time due to the pain, was grabbed by both of his wrists. His chin was tightly pressed against Keys's knee, and he choked back his scream. The young blue dragon attacked left and right, and his fist continuously hit his opponent's chest and ribs that were wide open. Rakshasa wanted to launch an attack, but Keys picked him up by the waist first. This was the throwing skill of the Twilight sect recorded in the booklet called 9 Sword Catalog. After the monster was lifted up and spun around, Keys threw him to the ground with his head in the posture of hitting the ground. With his head broken and bleeding, the false morale quickly faded. Rakshasa, who had the body of a 2-headed giant, was not beaten to death by the young blue dragon, who was playing with him. However, his rejoicing did not last long. The steampunk half-lich came to him. Snade's mechanical prosthesis firmly pressed the head of the evil demon, and the evil spell of memory extraction was cast. When he woke up again, he found that he had changed back into the form of a tabby cat used for disguise. He was like a Real wildcat lying on the wall of a house in Spat City, surrounded by a net rope that had been dried with salted fish. What's going on? Rakshas's brain seemed to have been mixed with sand and mud, and he could not remember what he had done yesterday. Terrified, the evil demon quickly jumped down from the wall and ran toward the newly built Bardo outpost in Spat City. Feeling a little dizzy, the tabby cat did not run on the roof. It could only crouch down and rush through the alleys. When it ran to the door of the tailor's shop, someone stepped into the shop before it. Last night, the half-lich Snade wanted to directly extract the memory of Rakshasa, but he found that there was a very clever curse lingering in its soul. If he forcibly extracted the memory, there would be no information to track. The half-lich had an idea. He only erased a small part of Rakshas's memory and changed it back into the form of a tabby cat. As expected, the first thing the evil demon did after waking up was to rush to its lair. "Boss, I need a set of custom-made clothes." The young blue dragon, who had been tracking the tabby cat, smiled at the female tailor. Chapter 172. This tiefling's reaction was somewhat unexpected to Keys. He had met her before, so she should know that he was a general in Bader's faction during the bloody battle. Since she dared to take out her weapon in such a situation, she was either fearless or truly rebellious. Raksha had just walked into the tailor's shop when he saw the tense situation. He immediately transformed from his tabby cat form into his demon form, which was more suited for combat. He immediately activated the magical restrictions here and sealed off the entrance to the tailor's shop. He then returned to his partner's side and carefully observed Roland's appearance. Since his memories of last night had been erased, Raksha only recalled that Roland had humiliated him in Coptic City. When he tried to recall more carefully, he couldn't help but inhale sharply. Although Roland had healed his injuries with magic, the soreness in his muscles still reminded him that some things were difficult to completely forget. Be careful. This guy, Raksha wanted to warn his partner, the tiefling, but he didn't expect that before he could even finish speaking, an enchanted bow would shoot at him at close range. A sharp arrow with a flash of lightning shot into the tiefling's right temple and out of his left eye socket. Raksha didn't even have time to scream in pain, nor did he have time to say anything like, "I'll be back." Thanks to his nature as a demon from the mortal plane, Raksha would always revive in Bader's hell after dying in the mortal plane. Raksha's body staggered and collapsed to the ground. He instantly transformed into a puddle of pus. Idiot who will never accomplish anything. The tiefling ranger glanced sideways at his demon partner. However, his main attention was still focused on General Badur. Keyes' sudden visit caught her off guard. "Honorable General, may I know why you've come?" The tiefling tossed her enchanted bow at her feet, indicating that she had no intention of attacking. She was intentionally stalling for time. The magical waves she had just sent over meant that the warning runes she had set up in the backyard were already taking effect. The hidden assassins would soon arrive to support her. Keyes, who was standing in the middle of the hall, suddenly twitched his nose a few times. His brows furrowed slightly for a moment before relaxing. However, the blue dragon youth, in human form, still unsheathed the adamantine scythe at his waist. He narrowed his eyes as he stared at the tiefling ranger with a burning gaze. "You join the abyss? Which great demon are you loyal to?" The backyard of the tailor's shop had now become a battlefield. The tieflings had placed their hopes on the assassins, and they were currently engaged in a bitter battle. Originally, the activation of the warning runes made the assassins very excited, because it meant that they could taste blood and slaughter again. It should be known that the tieflings hadn't hidden them for long. The tieflings had only obeyed the orders of the mixed-blood bastards out of fear of their masters. Therefore, when they could do something big and exercise their bodies, all of them became abnormally excited. They even forgot about their stealth innate skill and attacked their opponent from the front. They thirsted for blood, thirsted for slaughter, and thirsted for the taste of mortals' thin, rough tongues. That's right, they were demons from the lower planes, Babu demons. They were a type of Tana Reed demon that was born from the souls of mortal killers, assassins, and sadists who fell into the abyss. Babu demons were about 6 feet tall, but they only weighed about 140 pounds. This was why these demons appeared rather skinny. However, if an opponent was fooled by their appearance and underestimated the muscles under their skinny bodies, they would soon suffer the consequences of their actions. Apart from their deceptive physical strength, the Babu demons were also covered in a layer of viscous red liquid that resembled jelly. Any opponent that tried to attack them with their bare hands would first burn their own hands. In fact, even ordinary weapons wouldn't be able to resist the corrosion of this viscous red liquid. The ogre Neru and the Saint Sarai Jensen were rather surprised to encounter Babu demons in the material plane. However, after reminding the desert elf Brock of the characteristics of these Tana Reed demons, they still threw themselves into the battle with great enthusiasm. For the Saint Samurai, fighting against evil was in line with their beliefs, and it was their duty. For the ogres, it was just killing demons, and it wasn't like they had never done it before. Only Blatch had encountered such a monster from the lower planes for the first time. The desert elf sorcerer and supreme warrior carefully observed his opponent. However, the demons didn't take him seriously because the Babu demons would always take the initiative to attack the most threatening enemy without hesitation. Snader, Blue, and Paru were still busy with other tasks assigned to them by Keyes. The few people present didn't seem to be spellcasters. In the eyes of demons, excluding spellcasters, the larger the body of a creature in the material plane, the more powerful it was. Therefore, the first target of these Tana assassins was the largest ogre. They sprinted for a short distance and suddenly used their greater teleportation, spell-like ability to appear behind Neru. At least 4 barb ogres swung their machetes at Nalu, but the ogre reacted immediately. He raised his ebony chain high and swung it around. The chain, which was made from chain ogres, grew in size and blocked the barb ogre's weapons like a curtain. Clang! 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 The experienced ogre immediately rolled on the ground and dodged the sharp blade that was aimed at his kidney. At the same time, he used his strong body to crush the ambusher who was squatting on the side. The Babu demon's viscous red liquid stuck to Neru's armor, But with the quality of the material and the thickness of the armor, there was no need to worry about it being corroded by the viscous red liquid. The Babu demon's surprise attack failed, and the Saint Samurai seized the opportunity to attack. Due to their alignment, Jason's attack could cause fatal damage to the chaotic evil Tana re-demons. With the help of the holy power, the forged steel horse-chopping sword cut through the Babu demon's viscous red liquid like a hot knife cutting through butter. The unlucky evil spirit that had just been crushed by the ogre version of a road roller in heavy armor and was struggling to get up on the ground was cut in half by the Saint Samurai. It became the first victim in this battle. The remaining Babu demons immediately realized that the Saint Samurai was the most difficult opponent. In fact, they had underestimated this enemy. Almost all the demons turned around and began to attack Jason. The Tana demons still knew some tactics. They cunningly divided the battlefield by relying on their advantage in numbers. Some were responsible for blocking the violent attacks of the ogres and the death dance of the desert elves, while others surrounded the Saint Samurai. As if that was not enough, the demons also used dark magic spell-like abilities. The position where Jason was shrouded in darkness that no natural light could penetrate. The Babu demons who besieged the Saint Samurai sneered. After all, they were very familiar with blind fighting. But this optimism did not last long. Thanks to the strict training he had undergone since childhood, the gifted Saint Samurai had also mastered enough combat skills to deal with all kinds of situations. Even the deepest darkness could not stop his determination to kill the evil demon. The sound of weapons clashing was endless, and the demons besieging Jason cried out in pain. The forged steel horse-chopping sword that was infused with holy power was especially useful against the demons. Even a holy power was infused into the wind created by the sword when it was swung. The barrier of darkness that the Babu demons had deliberately created was quickly broken by the paladins. After all, the Saint Samurai had been unparalleled in front of the demon lord. It was not easy for him to deal with this group of small fries. Seeing the Saint Samurai, who was like a demon nightmare, walking towards him, and seeing the ogre who had broken the bones of his companions with a single blow, the Saint Samurai gave him a cruel smile. The last surviving Babu demon found that his summoning Tana spell-like ability had lost its effect. He could not remain calm at this time. Naturally, he could not deceive his own kind on the other side of the summoning channel and make them believe that he was having fun in the material plane. He was not happy at all. In despair, the Babu demon summoned the last of his courage and rushed towards the weakest desert elf. Damn it, as long as I can break out of this elf subspecies. It will only take a little while for the teleportation ability to be used again, and then the Babu demon encouraged himself until he heard an almost imperceptible sound. After fighting for half a day, Brock finally revealed his ability as a sound sorcerer. Through fighting with these demons of the lower realm, he slowly heard the vibrations emitted by these creatures. The infrasound waves rushed into the Babu demon's internal organs before it could complete its psychological construction. It had to be said that the demon's physique was much better than that of mortals. Even if they were continuously injured by the infrasound waves, the Babu demon only stiffened and fell to the ground in pain. It only fell into a state of dizziness and did not die directly. Brock stopped Nalu and was about to follow up with a blow that would definitely make the Babu demon's head explode. Maybe Mr. Keys still has a use for it. The desert elf gestured with his chin and pointed at the puddles of foam and pus around them. After the demons died, there was a high probability that there would be no corpses left. He guessed that Keys might have come to Spat City for a reason, so he thought that it would be better to leave some evidence behind. However, this did help Keys. Unlike the successful operation in the tailor's shop, the young blue dragon encountered a small setback. Although it was not difficult to capture a tiefling ranger, what happened next was unexpected by Keys. The traitor Bar, though, who was firmly imprisoned by his force field spell, died instantly from the curse. Even his soul was destroyed. If Brock and the others had not left a Babu demon behind, not only would this new unsolved case be unsolved, but even some of the preparations that Keys had made before coming here would have been in vain. With many doubts and puzzlement, Keys and the others brought the evidence in a wooden bucket to the consul's mansion in Spat City. He needed to go there to make an accusation. Chapter 173. Ever since the Glove Dragon crossed the river and swept away the original underground forces of Spat, the leaders of the local gangs who had been suppressing Haoya's gang were also taken care of and wiped out. No longer suppressed, Broken Tooth's business became more and more unscrupulous. He was not a local. Broken Tooth was a fugitive from Bite City. When he first escaped to Spat, he helped others escape in order to make a living. The citizens of the city suffered from Aigu's exploitation, so some people helped them escape to other places in Medici in exchange for money. Broken Tooth had experience in escaping successfully, so he quickly took advantage of this to get a lot of business. Smart as he was, he knew that he could not fight alone, so he developed his own gang. At first, Loose Tooth and his gang only charged a little more, but later it developed into colluding with the bandits to intercept and kill the fugitives. This way, they could save on transportation costs, and the bandits would devour the victims like hyenas. Now that the bandits were in the stomachs of the Megalosaurus Pasha, Broken Tooth's gang changed their way of doing business. They attracted the customers of Sparut City with super low prices that could be calculated by any smart person with their eyes closed and that were far below the cost of production. When these customers walked out of the city with hope and into the wild desert, they would become the goods of Broken Tooth's gang. Born in Bite City, Broken Tooth started a special business that only existed in Bite City: human smuggling. What the Japanese wanted to do, but failed, was done by a gang of mobs from Spat. In their own country, the Medici had once again become slaves that could be bought and sold. What was even more frightening was that Broken Tooth's business was in short supply. It was this market environment that made Broken Tooth have to do a good job of open source and throttling. The so-called throttling was to reduce the losses on the way. His subordinates always complained that some people just could not learn how to accept the arrangement of fate, so they had to teach them with swords. But Broken Tooth came up with a solution in the end. He asked his subordinates to separate the men from the women and the women from the children. The women could not live without their children, and the men could not live without their wives and children. This way, no one dared to resist the management of Broken Tooth's gang. The so-called open source was much more troublesome. Originally, Big Tooth wanted to lower the cost of recruiting customers, but since they had drained the pond to catch all the fish, there weren't many potential customers left in Spat. As a last resort, White Teeth had to pick up his old craftsmanship in Bite City. He began to use violent means, kidnapping the city's lower-class citizens to fill his stockpile of goods. Who didn't have family, friends, or old friends? The Broken Teeth gang's perverse behavior forced some people to seek help from a new underground king of Spat City, the boss who was like a father glove. The latter naturally retaliated against House Tooth many times, forcing him to hide for a long time. It wasn't until Tsaya met his destined benefactor that things took a turn for the better. The Tiefling Ranger found this unscrupulous scoundrel and used his powerful evil demon assassins as an investment to force the Tiefling Ranger into joining the Broken Teeth gang's business. Although the Tieflings had already betrayed the Bartho faction, it wasn't until Keys suddenly went to the Bartho faction and caused the Tieflings to make the wrong decision that they were exposed. However, this Devil's Outpost had been run by Medic for many years. Naturally, there were many nobles among its business partners. The Fallen Aigu family was naturally part of the Tieflings' network, which was disguised as a seamstress. With her acting as the middleman, Tsaya easily became acquainted with a certain important person in the Aigu family. It was because of this that Tsaya dared to ignore Glove's pursuit and reappear in Spat City. Not only that, but the Tiefling's partner also allowed Tsaya to come into contact with a business that was far more profitable than his previous one. This scoundrel had known about Schema before, but only recently had he seen Moon Candy. With his previous status, he would never have had the opportunity to see such expensive goods that only rich merchants and nobles could afford. With the Tiefling's encouragement, Tsaya began to try selling this expensive, depraved, and deadly alchemical medicine in his own territory. However, in just a few short days, Saya was astonished by his abundant income. This also strengthened his resolve to enter this field. Not to mention, his partner had promised him that if there were any problems with starting capital, he could use the cheap products he had previously sold as the equivalent to purchase the raw materials for making moon candy. Distribution channels, supply channels, starting capital, these were all major prerequisites that one had to consider in order to do business. Only Tsaya's old rival, Glove, who was like a father to him, might be jealous and cross the line to compete with him. Saya still didn't know how much Glove hated skuma and moon candy. However, Saya wasn't wrong. If Glove knew that Saya was doing this business, apart from handing him the black glove, it was likely that Glove would personally strangle this scoundrel to death. I have to eliminate this potential threat, Saya thought to himself. Even if I have to pay a price, I won't hesitate to lose some cute silver Kate. Today, Saya woke up especially early. He was going to pay a visit to that important person and discuss what kind of price he would have to pay to get his help in dealing with Glove. Saya ate his breakfast while thinking about his plan. Since his teeth weren't good, the chef had cut up the mutton on his plate in advance. The minced mutton was mixed with dried fruits and raisins. The layer of black plum sauce on the mutton looked like a bruise from a beating. After breakfast, Saya carefully tidied up his appearance. Then, he had the gang members investigate the route before he got on his own sedan and headed to the location arranged by the important person. The location of the meeting wasn't at the mansion of the important person. Meeting with a notorious person like Saya would definitely damage his reputation if others saw him. Therefore, they met in an inconspicuous residential area. When Saya arrived at the designated location, he arranged for his subordinates to spread out to guard the surroundings before he walked in with 2 bodyguards. Unlike the style of the apartment outside, this room was very dark and had a strong smell of incense and dust on the carpet. The muddy light from the old-fashioned oil lamp covered everything in the room with the color of red wine. This kind of atmosphere was indeed very suitable for secretly plotting things that outsiders wouldn't know about. However, the passionate conversation between Saya and the important person, as well as their subtle expressions, were clearly heard by the 3 people in the distance. "Why do you think Keys is spending so much effort?" Brew asked suspiciously as he raised his roasted mutton for breakfast and gnawed on it. In the limited knowledge of the ogres, whether it was as an evil dragon or a pasha, Keys didn't need to use so many tricks on small people. If he wanted something, he could just take it away. Would the other party dare to resist? Which Dr. Peru heard his brother's words and shook his head to indicate that he didn't understand either. He continued to focus on concocting the potion in his hand. The green-legged dragon snake that Nalu brought back had been made into a tonic. Paru would force Nalu, who had just recovered from serious illness, to drink some of it every day. Snader, who was born in Morseblight City, understood Key's plan very well. Thus, the steampunk half-lich maintained the spell in his hand while explaining to the ogre brothers. When an evil dragon uses its claws to plunder wealth, it's inevitable that some things will fall out from the gaps between its claws. Boss is preparing to use order and law as his plundering tools. He wants to squeeze all of them dry. Let's wait for a good show. After saying this, the half-lich continued to eavesdrop on the conversation between the 2 people in the distance. Due to his nature as a drow, even though he had become an undead, he couldn't make himself give up on his love for conspiracies and plots. In addition to the 3 companions of the young blue dragon, Glove also brought his men to help. In order to ensure the safety of the meeting, Saya spread out some of his elite forces to the nearby streets. Among these people, many of them were experts introduced by his new partner. In fact, the Tiefling Ranger did not want her own people to discover the existence of the Babu demons. She had arranged for all the assassins under her to stay by Hawkeye's side under the pretext of ensuring the safety of her business. These people weren't ordinary thugs. Not only were they specially trained, but some of them even had infernal blood. Glove's men had no chance of winning against these professional assassins. They might even suffer a great loss. Fortunately, Snade had given Glove an enchanted bone ring in advance. With the help of this ring, Glove was able to command the meticulously modified skeleton puppet made from the corpse of an elite Bugalaw demon ape. In the face of a half-inferno assassin with demon hound blood, the demonic skeleton puppet showed its usefulness. Glove's men originally wanted to surround and kill Xiaoya's men who were disguised as street thugs, but who would have thought that the other party would turn around and hunt them down. When the half-inferno assassin pounced on a human and tried to bite the victim's throat with its protruding mouth, the demonic skeleton puppet silently appeared beside the half-inferno assassin. Before the half-inferno assassin could react, the demonic skeleton puppet opened its ribs and attached itself to the half-inferno assassin. The sturdy demonic skeleton puppet tightly wrapped around the half-inferno assassin, and its sharp bone spike stabbed into the half-inferno assassin's throat and heart. After killing the half-inferno assassin, the demonic skeleton puppet changed its shape and turned into a large cat. It fled from the shadows of the street towards the other half-inferno assassin. All that was left was a pool of blood on the ground, as well as pieces of minced meat. With the help of the demonic skeleton puppet, Glove's men quickly cleared the street. Chapter 174. If the beginning of journey is not smooth, it rarely ends well. The current consul of Spat City muttered in his heart. He had once read this sentence in the library of Bite City. He was saddened by his 10-year tenure, and at the same time, he was mourning the horse he had recently tamed. Instead of becoming a governor as his family had arranged, he actually wanted to be a general of medic. Every morning, he would drive the two-wheeled chariot to the training field in his mansion for a while. This was also a good way for him to escape from the troubles in Spat. But today he was riding his horse, enjoying the leisure and free air. Suddenly, a wooden bucket with an iron hoop flew in, and a humanoid object with its limbs cut off rolled out of the bucket. The horrifying object emitted a terrifying aura. The galloping horses were startled and reared up. Then, the two-wheeled chariot behind them rolled them into the bottom of the chariot. One of the horses hit its head on a protruding pebble and lay on the ground, gasping for breath. The other horse's hip broke an axle, and its neck was crushed by the wheel. Fortunately, the governor, who was driving the chariot, was thrown out and fell on the soft sand beside the road before the chariot overturned. Except for some scratches and bruises on his arms, he did not suffer any serious injuries. The angry governor immediately cursed the guards in the training field. But when he noticed that the silent warriors glanced at the culprit standing aside, he felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if a basin of cold water had been poured over his head, extinguishing his anger in an instant. Should he seek compensation from a megalosaurus, or should he seek justice from his superior, the Pasha? The young governor quickly made the choice that his elders had taught him. Just like when he faced Pharaoh's hateful relatives, he swallowed his anger and made a compromise. Sir, I didn't know that you would suddenly visit. Before he took office, he had visited the Megalosaurus Pasha, as usual, so the governor recognized Keys in his human form. Forgive me for not greeting you earlier. What can I do for you? Of course, the consul didn't think that Keys's sudden visit was just because he was bored or just to harm his horses. Therefore, he took the initiative to express his attitude and expressed his willingness to obey the Pasha's orders. You're really perceptive. The young blue dragon secretly evaluated this young subordinate of his. This had slightly affected the plan he had made before coming here, but it was no big deal. As you can see, Keys pointed at the monster struggling on the cobblestone path of the training ground, the Babu demon assassin, who had crawled out of a broken barrel and was missing limbs and tongue. He could only make meaningless ho-ho sounds. This is a kind of Tana wreathed demon called the Babu demon. They can only do evil in the abyss, if there is a word for evil there. But I found that they are making a living in the city under your jurisdiction. You didn't hear wrong. It's them, but now only one of them is alive. The consul carefully observed and glanced at the struggling Babu demon, but most of his attention was still on the Pasha. He felt that although Keys's tone was harsh, he didn't seem to have any intention of denouncing him. He probed, Lord Keys, where did you find these Babu demons? If anyone in Spat dares to collude with the otherworldly demons, as the consul of this city, I will not let them off easily. The young consul put himself in the right camp with just a few words. Looking at the consul's face, the young blue dragon showed a smile of approval. That's right, we can't let the audacious members of the Igu family off easily. The young consul, who was still talking, was stunned at first. Then he thought for a moment and said solemnly, "Based on the reputation of that family, it is indeed possible for them to do such a disgraceful thing. But if we want to punish them for their sins, it won't be enough with just one demon. We also need a chain of evidence to support it. After all, they have some influence in the capital of Medica, you know." Indeed, possibly, punish. These words showed the consul's keen judgment. He understood the result that Keyes wanted. As for some influence, it pointed out where the resistance to achieve this result would come from. "You are worried about the interference of the Obsidian Council?" The Megalosaurus Pasha thought for a moment and asked directly. After all, he didn't know much about the power of the upper echelons of Medica. "I heard that you and the Igu family had a disagreement over the handling of a batch of food. It was the Obsidian Council of Bite that pressured you, right?" The consul didn't answer Keyes' question. He just nodded solemnly. From his reaction, the young blue dragon confirmed his previous guess. The Obsidian Council was a new group, and all of its members were spellcasters of noble birth. And it seemed that it had been approved by Pharaoh, so it could develop in just a few decades. Although this council had no official authority in Medica, because its members were mages and nobles, it actually had a lot of weight in the center of the empire. Some people thought that this was a new organization supported by Pharaoh in order to balance the power of the Grand Vader. Except for the Grand Vader himself, all parties involved had denied this rumor. But facts were facts, and denial was useless. The original intention of the Obsidian Council was to fight for the interests of the noble mages. Since Medica abolished the slavery system, those who could be used to recharge the obsidian magic beads were limited to the sinners and slaves in Bite City. As a result, the limited resources gave rise to disputes over the allocation of resources. The needs of the city's garrison mages and the needs of the Spell Research Academy accounted for most of the obsidian magic beads produced in Medica every year. The spellcasters of noble birth believed that they should occupy more quotas than the mages of commoners. In order to achieve this goal, they spontaneously formed a group, and this group was managed by the Obsidian Council, which was elected by them. In addition to using their status as nobles to fight for more obsidian magic bead quotas, the Obsidian Council also used their status as mages to speak up for the nobles. In their view, this was a necessary means to expand the group's influence. And it was precisely because of this that although the Igu family was very bad, when a new consul had different opinions and disputes with them, the noble mage group far away in Bite still put a lot of pressure on the consul. Spellcasters were dangerous, but in comparison, the Megalosaurus was much more deadly. The Obsidian Council is just a motley crew. The Grand Vader should make some time now. Consul, you have to understand that compromise is not the way. It's more important to choose a side. Choose us or them. When Keyes finished this sentence, the young official immediately made his choice. As the official seal of the Consul of Spat City was sent out, 2 platoons of city guards gathered. The garrison mages also sent out several mages in gray robes to report. In the secret room, where Hawkeye and the Big Shot were meeting, the 2 cunning fellows were drawing up a plan to divide the profits. In their view, the gloves industry was already in their pockets. Since they had to rely on the power of the Igu family, Hawkeye did not reap any real benefits. Damn it, how black-hearted. Hawkeye cursed the other party's greed in his heart as he secretly planned how to swallow up the gloves' underground forces. But suddenly, a soft sound interrupted the scoundrel's train of thought. A monster the size of a candlestick suddenly appeared in the dark room. It had bat-like wings and a pair of short horns that curved forward. It looked like a miniature version of an evil monster. It was a quasit. As if stimulated by the smell of incense in the air, the quasit began to sneeze as soon as it appeared. This also made its rat-like squeaking sound become intermittent. "There's a chew, enemy, a chew trap, a chew run." Its words were directed at the Big Shot of the Igu family who was hiding his face, the youngest son of the old Igu. On the other hand, the two bodyguards who were originally by Hawkeye's side to protect him were glaring at the little demon, wanting to get rid of it quickly. They had no choice. The two bodyguards were the original team of Tiefling Rangers sent to Hawkeye's side. They had the bloodline of the creatures from the 9 prisons of Bader, so they were naturally hostile to demons. The cunning Quasit also noticed this. After reporting its discovery, it turned into a small snake and burrowed into its master's sleeve. Although it thirsted for victory and power like other demons, it had the heart of a coward. This Tana, Reed's demon, was the magical pet of Aigu's youngest son. In fact, many inexperienced mages would choose such a creature as their magical pet companion. Quasits were not only agile, but they could also turn invisible or turn into other small animals to investigate. At the same time, they also had a spell-like ability similar to theurgy. Every week, they had the opportunity to pray to a mysterious existence and ask 6 questions. For a fledgling spellcaster, this kind of magical pet was quite convenient to use. However, no matter how weak a demon was, it was still a demon. It was always coveting the soul of its master, dragging it into the abyss and filling its body. Aigu's youngest son immediately stood up after receiving the Quasit's report. As he chanted the spell he had prepared, an entrance to a secret passage appeared in the corner of the dark room. "Hurry up and go in," he roared at Hawkeye in a very anxious tone. "This is a trap set by the consul and the glove. We can't let others know that we're meeting here. You must remember." The Quasit's demon, who was shocked by his tone, quickly stood up and called his 2 bodyguards to go into the secret passage together. However, they only walked down a few dozen steps before they realized that it was actually a dead end. When Hawkeye thought of something in horror and wanted to turn around and rush out of the secret passage, a fireball was thrown into the secret passage from above. Aigu's youngest son was already prepared. He wanted to make sure that Hawkeye and his men were dead. Chapter 175. He was riding a gray 6-legged warhorse with a shiny leather saddle inlaid with gorgeous silver ornaments. Each of the warhorse's hooves was the size of a plate, which allowed it to run on the flood-soaked beach without sinking and looked very light. As long as we can get out of Spat City. No. As long as we can get out of the province ruled by the Megalosaurus Pasha, we could draw a clear line with Hawkeye and his gang. The rider on the horse muttered to himself. Old Aigu's youngest son was a spellcaster and also a fan of the Obsidian Council. He was willing to compromise and make friends with people like Hawkeye because Hawkeye could provide a large number of slaves for him to make obsidian magic beads. But this kind of behavior was neither honorable nor legal. If he was stopped on the spot by the consul soldiers, he was afraid that not only would his noble identity be used by people with ulterior motives, but his brothers and sisters who wanted to monopolize old Aigu's inheritance would also not hesitate to hit him when he was down. Fortunately, he was alert enough and arranged everything in advance. The dead Hawkeye certainly could not disclose the details of the deal. Unfortunately, his magic attainments were still too shallow. For a master of the school of necromancy, it was not too difficult to make the dead speak. And as a Demolic, Snade could do more. Squeak, a terrible enemy, is coming. The rider who was constantly urging the 6-legged warhorse was suddenly frightened by the scream of his magic pet. The Quasit flapped its wings and hovered in front of the mage. It pointed its claws behind the rider and warned loudly. When little Aigu heard this, he turned around and saw that a monster had unknowingly followed him not far behind. The monster was 12 feet tall and as long as 3 grown men put together. It used a ridiculous 4-legged hopping method to move forward, but its speed was extraordinary and it almost didn't make any sound. And because the rider turned around, he did not notice the evil smile on his magic pet's face. The little demon took advantage of its master's inattention and ruthlessly pierced the neck of the 6-legged warhorse with its poisonous claws. There was no doubt that, as a magic pet, the Quasits always planned to kill their mage master. However, they were usually limited by the spell contract, so they couldn't directly attack the mage. The poison flowed through the blood vessels in the horse's neck and into its heart. The pitiful horse instantly fell to its knees and rolled away. While the magic pet pretended to be worried, a magic protection necklace on little Aigu's body worked, preventing his neck from breaking and dying. Taking advantage of this momentary lapse, the monster that had been tailing them from afar suddenly sped up and caught up. When little Aigu struggled to stand up with bruises all over his body, he saw a tall, shiny, charcoal-black humanoid creature with blue-white flaming eyes appear not far in front of him and bow down. Is it bowing to me? However, when a monster raised its head and revealed its evil, bright yellow eyes on its charcoal-black, cracked face, little Aigu knew that the other party was up to no good. When a monster opened its mouth and revealed its missing front teeth, little Aigu knew who it was. Or rather, it used to be. After all, this monster was just a cinder spawn awakened by the demonic Snade. Siege Hammer. The young mage didn't suspect anything and immediately used the obsidian magic orb he carried with him to activate the additional spell on the force field ring. The fresh out of the oven, cinder spawn obviously didn't have much experience and was immediately sent flying by the force field spell. Magic Pet's Attribute Absorption. Restricted by the spell contract, the Quasit's magic pet had a part of its agility extracted by the mage in a helpless cry. This made the little demon much clumsier, and even flapping its wings to fly in the air was a bit difficult. The mage's movements became faster. He quickly retreated and maintained a certain distance from the undead creature. The cinder spawn that was sent flying by the force field spell also got up. After letting out an unknown howl, a light blue frostfire shield appeared around its body. It returned to its previous four-legged posture and jumped up to pounce on little Aigu. The last memory of its life was branded in the soul of the cinder spawn, and it had an incomparable hatred for its murderer. After being created by the Demolic, its only wish was to find the murderer for revenge. The anger of being deceived and the pain of being blasted and burned into charcoal by the fireball all surged into its heart. The cinder spawn longed to use its iron-like hands to tear apart the murderer's charming aristocratic face and reveal the blackened brain matter. The cinder spawn longed to hold its opponent tightly and let the frost fire around its body absorb the heat of every drop of blood. But the prerequisite was that it could catch its opponent. After absorbing a part of the agility of the Quasit's magic pet, the young mage's movement ability greatly improved. He could always predict the landing point of the cinder spawn's pounce in advance and nimbly dodge it. At the same time, the spellcasting movements in his hands also became smoother. Water Creation Spell. Although he wasn't too sure what kind of undead creature the monster in front of him was, little Aigu still noticed some of the characteristics of the cinder spawn during the battle. It didn't seem to be able to pass through places with water. Even if there was some mud under its feet, it would still carefully avoid it. After the spell took effect, the mage was surrounded by large and small puddles of water. He himself was standing in a shallow pit where the water didn't even reach his knees. The cinder spawn roared angrily, but for a moment, it couldn't find an attack route to land its feet on. Seeing that his idea had worked, little Aigu's face showed a relieved smile. He began to try chanting spells with the effects of berate undead creatures and expel undead creatures. As the mage's spell gradually took shape, the cinder spawn fell into a dilemma. If it continued to stay here, it would be vulnerable to the attack of the spell specifically targeted at undead creatures. Just the sound of the incantation reaching its ears made it feel uncomfortable. If it chose to leave, it would go against the vengeance in its soul. For undead creatures, the consequences were more severe than the heart-wrenching pain. Just as the cinder spawn was hesitating, a strong acid rain suddenly fell from the sky. The wyvern sent by the Lord of the Dragon's nest launched a surprise attack on the mage. The mage, who was concentrating on chanting the spell, didn't have time to dodge before the acid rain enveloped him. The pain of his flesh being burned almost made little Aigu faint. However, he was afraid that the acid would corrode his body, so he still tightly closed his mouth and nose. Just as he was about to put up a magic shield to protect himself, The wyvern launched a pounce on its prey from the sky. The mage, who was ridden by the wyvern, completely lost the ability to resist this time. He was directly stunned by the wyvern's powerful strike. Ignoring the threatening roars of the undead creatures on the ground, the wyvern grabbed its spoils and flew back to Spat. The Babu demon whose limbs were cut off, the big boss Bleaktooth who was turned into a cinder spawn after being murdered, the young mage whose handsome face was burned by the wyvern's acid, and all the important members of the Igu family who were invited to participate in the hearing. Gathering under the same roof as these guys made the young Archon feel deeply uncomfortable. However, he was also glad because, according to the Megalosaurus Pasha's saying, birds of a feather flock together. Feeling uncomfortable proved that he was not the same as them. At least, he would not be in danger of losing his life. I say, what kind of trick are you playing? The one who spoke on behalf of the Igu family was the eldest son of old Igu. He had a broad chest like his father, a thick neck like a tree trunk, and a small head under his messy red hair. He looked like a small tomato on a big coffin. Why do you put my family in the same room with these monsters? I heard that you're also a noble. Why don't you know any etiquette? The Archon coughed. Oh, I see. He organized his words and said concisely in a serious tone. Some people accuse the Igu family of secretly communicating with demons from other planes, participating in the skuma contraband trade, intending to partner with illegal merchants who have engaged in slave smuggling, manipulating the food trade, and ignoring the people of Spat, and forcibly collecting taxes that the Medici Empire has not collected. You're bullshitting. The furious eldest son of old Igu took a step forward and pointed at the Archon's face with a finger as thick as a carrot. You dare to slander the reputation of the Igu family. I'm going to challenge you to a duel. One-on-one. I'm going to tear your mouth apart. At 3 more. Intimidating the Archon, intending to assassinate the Archon, and attempting to subvert the foundation of Pharaoh Medici's rule. The young official wiped his face that was splashed with a few drops of saliva and said loudly to the clerk standing beside him. Several gray-robed mages and city guards quickly became alert. They surrounded several important members of the Igu family. Swords were unsheathed, and spells were ready to be recited. For a moment, the Archon's mansion was full of murderous intent. Seeing that the situation was not good, the eldest son of old Igu immediately rushed to the door. The reckless man who had just clamored for a duel was actually very meticulous. He clearly felt that there must be something behind the Archon's 180-degree change in attitude. In any case, it was best to escape first. Those recruited mercenaries should be able to fight when the time comes. His idea was very good, but like all the non-protagonists who forcibly added scenes for themselves, his plan was always interrupted by something. 2 soldiers who were tied up like dumplings, there seemed to be no similar food in the Ash world, were thrown at his feet. The sudden obstacle tripped Igu. He was just about to pull out the scimitar at his waist when his palm was poked by several soldiers with spears. The guy covered his hand and lay on the ground wailing. Only then did he recognize that the ones who tripped him were the 2 mercenary corps leaders hired by the Igu family. Keyes walked into the door of the council hall and said to the Archon, I have to add one more thing. The Igu family intended to attack me, the Pasha. The crime is unpardonable and will be executed on the spot. All the assets of the family will be confiscated and handled by the Pasha. When the young blue dragon finished these words, he was calculating in his heart. The money for the first investment has been settled. Chapter 176. Herbs were hanging from the diagonal pillars of the roof. There were mint, wild garlic, thyme, chamomile, rushes, palamo, king leaf, horseshoe, wormwood, laurel, and so on. The herbs were naturally dried in the shade and emitted a fragrance. These are the specimens Mr. Paru gave me. Seeing Keyes notice his room full of herbs after entering the door, Santos hurriedly explained, The caravan is running around. If possible, I will try my best to collect some materials for that person. The young blue dragon in human form nodded. In fact, it was the fat merchant's service advantage in this last pale sand that made him decide to invest in the sand rhino caravan. And the money he plundered after uprooting the Igu family came in handy at this time. 100,000 silver cats is there. You can count it first. Keys pointed to the iron box placed at the door. In the province under my jurisdiction, there will be a team of elite Dragonborn clan to protect you and the safety of this money. But if you want to go to other provinces to buy sand rhinos, you must do adequate security work. After all, this money is not a small amount. Santos looked at the huge sum of money close at hand. His joy was beyond words, and his small, squinted eyes seemed to widen a little. In response to Megalosaurus Pasha's safety advice, the fat merchant patted his chest and said, "Sir, you don't know how many sand rhinos we can buy in bulk. Your Excellency, you may not know this, but even the camel beast bazaars in a few cities can't afford to purchase large quantities of sand rhinos in the future. I've already contacted my close friends. They will send representatives to buy the sand rhinos first. The lowest price is suitable, and the high-quality livestock will be our priority supplier." These words reminded Keys that he had indeed underestimated Medica's commercial development. He didn't expect that in the Ashen world where sword and magic was the main theme, there would also be a bidding mechanism. Because he was interested, he patiently communicated with the fat merchant for a long time. After making sure that he had learned all about bidding, what Santos called buying the sand rhinos, Keys got up and said goodbye. After harvesting the leeks of the Igu family, the young blue dragon's money bag was indeed filled by a lot. Even after investing 100,000 silver cats in Santos, Keys still had more than 400,000 silver cats and a little less copper debentures in his hands. Due to the Medici silver and copper coin system, most wealthy families would exchange copper debentures for silver cats, which had more purchasing power. Therefore, the young blue dragon received more silver coins than copper coins from the Igu family. There were many rumors that indicated that some of the mutated dragons that were famous across the multiverse had a hobby of eating coins as snacks. Although our main character was a little envious of this, he was very rational and didn't follow suit. In any case, the Megalosaurus devoured metals to convert them into metal ions and use them to strengthen itself. In that case, Krypton consumption of simple metals, such as some coins, was not as noble as soil consumption of metal compounds, such as some minerals. That was purely a waste. Well, it's shameful to be wasteful. It's easy to go from frugality to extravagance, but hard to go from extravagance to frugality. Anyway, our Keys was a rational creature on the side of order, and he could always convince himself well. At the very least, the author of the book could give the main character some immunity to sour grapes. Moreover, after listening to the fat merchant Santos's introduction of the buyout trade, the young blue dragon was keenly aware of the importance of this model. As a pasha, unless he completely gave up on seizing power from the social class system of human society, he had to solve the financial problems within the province under the jurisdiction of the tenants. Harvesting leeks couldn't be done overnight. After harvesting the Igu family, Keys was ready to negotiate with the Grand Dimensional Empire. He originally hoped to get financial support from the Medici Empire. At the very least, he should get a share of the compensation from the Neon Empire. However, it was obvious that even with the financial support, it would take a long time to do so. Of all the cities under his pasha's jurisdiction, two were affected by the Wusan invasion, Nome and Spat. The latter was under his control. After the Igu family was destroyed, the new consul had enough food to provide relief to the people in the city. In addition, the city itself was an agricultural city. After the flood, the harvest in the following year should be good. The situation was gradually getting better. But Nome City was different. The massacre of the Neon Empire had reduced the population of the city by 7 to 8 out of 10. The city could not even maintain the basic operations of the city. Not only that, but many of the city's citizens had also begun to escape from Nome. After leaving Spat, Keys directly sent Snader to Nome to investigate. According to the information he sent back, the city was indeed about to become a ghost town. Because of the Neon Empire's sins, a large number of broken dead souls were lingering around the strategic teleportation gate. In the words of the Demolik, he felt very comfortable staying there. Presumably, ordinary people living nearby would be very miserable. Although the broken dead souls could still be kept together for the time being, if left alone for a long time, these bound spirits might spread to the entire Gnome City. Other than that, there was another problem that needed to be solved. As a former trading city, the citizens of Nome were undoubtedly wealthier than those of Spat. After the Neon Empire's looting and massacre, those who were able to stay were even wealthier. They could have bought food from the passing merchants, even if they had to pay several times the price. But now, because of the evil spirits left behind by Nome's trade routes, the wealthy citizens were struggling to find something to support their ribs. This caused a large number of Gnomes-born merchants to choose to leave. Only a few who had fantasized about the aid of the Medici Empire chose to stay. And the number of these people, like their little remaining confidence, was decreasing by the day. Nome was once a commercial pearl. Keys did not want to give up on this city that connected the north and south of Medici. Its survival was related to whether the business blueprint that the young Blue Dragon had drawn up would be able to be carried out smoothly. Key's original plan was to use Brock's appeal to attract some tribesmen to settle down in Gnome City with his identity as a desert elf. But this way, humans and desert elves would not be able to coexist peacefully in a city. Just the population of the nearby tribesmen would not be able to support a large human city like Nome that could accommodate hundreds of thousands of people in a short period of time. The key problem was to boost confidence. After stopping the outflow of Gnome City's population, they had to reopen the trade routes. Only in this way would more peddlers and pawns slowly gather in this city. And the buying pow that Santos of the Sand Rhino Caravan had mentioned just now gave Keys some inspiration. What could move a person the most? Wealth moved people's hearts. If they could hold a large-scale commercial auction in Gnome City, then the merchants who flocked to Silver Cartes and Copper Debon would definitely muster up the courage to go. After communicating with Paulu, Brew, and Snader, who was far away in Nome, Keys came up with the prototype of the bidding plan. After telling Santos about the plan, the fat merchant who had some feelings for Nome also expressed his full support for the Pasha's good governance. Using the business network that the Sand Rhino Caravan had built up over many years, as well as the means of communication such as eagles and spells, Santos passed on the news that the Megalosaurus Pasha was going to publicize the buying pow in Gnome City to the big merchants of many industries. He also used his own reputation as a guarantee. As for the procurement areas involved in this plan, it was not a small matter. From building materials, metal, wood, fur, food, and other raw materials, to construction, commercial transportation, metal processing, and other services to weapons, armor, livestock, and other miscellaneous items, there was everything. In order to increase the credibility of the plan, Santos' Sand Rhino Caravan left the city of the Dragonborn clan for Nome on the same day. When they left, they opened the lid of the wooden box that held the 100,000 silver cartes that Keys had invested in, ostentatiously showing it through the streets. For the sake of safety, not only were the three ogre brothers, the paladins, and the desert elves personally escorting the caravan, the Dragonborn clan had also sent elite desert kobold warriors to accompany them. Under the blazing sun, the shining silver cartes attracted the attention of the human merchants who were doing business in the Dragonborn clan's town. Everyone knew that this batch of wealth was headed in the direction of Gnome City. Seeing the exaggerated discussions among the merchants about the wealth, Keys knew that his free advertisement this time was a success. Then, the young Blue Dragon quietly disappeared. He did not follow the Sand Rhino Caravan, but went to Nome first. In Gnome City, the half-liches who had received the approval of the Megalosaurus Pasha started their old trade. In order to open the strategic teleportation gate, the Japanese had slaughtered nearly 80,000 people here. Coupled with the destruction of the Japanese Expeditionary Army, the city had gained nearly 100,000 corpses in the short span of a month. Other than a small number of fresh corpses that were buried for fear of causing a plague, most of the corpses that had been drained of their life force and turned into dried corpses were piled up in the manhole under the giant teleportation gate. No one cared about them. In the eyes of the masters of the school of necromancy, these were all misplaced resources. Using the accumulated negative energy here and the broken soul fragments that had not been completely consumed, Snade easily awakened a large number of skeletons. Not only did this reduce the concentration of negative energy, it also solved the hidden problem of the bound spirits. Moreover, these undead creatures that were summoned did not know the meaning of fatigue. They were the best laborers. The Nomians who were lucky enough to survive the Japanese all lived in the rich district of the city. After taking care of the newly appointed consul, an unlucky man who had been exiled to Nome and spent his days drinking and lamenting, Snade followed the orders of the Megalosaurus Pasha and sent guards to temporarily seal off the rich district. A large number of skeleton laborers were put to work and threw themselves into the construction of the other districts of Nome City. Under the Half-Lich's command, they flattened the uninhabited houses and gathered the construction materials for other purposes. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.